I was asleep when a sudden drilling noise shattered the silence of my own home. I rushed out and saw my son-in-law removing my bedroom door while I was still inside. "You've been getting confused. We need to watch you," he said calmly. My daughter said nothing. I didn't argue. I just stepped back and waited for the right moment. The next morning, as frantic pounding filled the house, he finally understood he could remove the door, but never take my place as the owner. Welcome to the story. Before we begin, take a second to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from today. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Just a quick note, some details have been dramatized for storytelling purposes, and any similarities to names or settings are purely coincidental. The vibration didn't just wake me, it rattled the very bones of my skull, a high-pitched mechanical shriek that shouldn't have existed in the quiet sanctuary of my own bedroom. I jolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs, a cold sweat instantly slicking my skin. For a moment, disorientation anchored me to the mattress. The Tuesday afternoon sun was slanting through the blinds at a sharp golden angle, but the room was filled with a fine dancing mist of sawdust. I, Thane Garrison, a 71-year-old retired investigative journalist with a sharp gaze that hadn't dulled since my days at the Seattle Times, found myself staring at the foot of my bed, where two men stood like grave robbers. One was a stranger in grease-stained overalls holding a power drill, and the other was Beckett Osborne, 42, a man whose expensive silk shirt couldn't hide the predatory tension in his shoulders, standing there with the unearned confidence of a startup founder who had burned through everyone else's money. "What in God's name are you doing?" I rasped, my voice sounding thin and foreign, even to my own ears. "Take it easy," Thane Beckett said, his voice dripping with that oily, rehearsed patience he used when he was trying to sell a lie. "You're getting worked up over nothing. We're just making some improvements." I watched in frozen horror as the stranger, a man Beckett called Dimitri, leaned back into the wood. The drill screamed again, biting into the brass of my door hinges with a spray of sparks. It wasn't a repair. They weren't fixing a squeak or a latch. They were taking the door off its frame while I was still in the bed. Have you ever felt like a ghost in your own hallways? That's the moment the haunting began for me. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the cold floor biting at my soles. "Stop that right now," I commanded, trying to summon the authority I once held in a bustling newsroom. "This is my bedroom." Beckett didn't even look at me. He checked his watch, a heavy platinum thing that looked far too expensive for a man whose last 3 ventures had ended in bankruptcy. "It's for your own safety, Dad," he said, finally turning to meet my gaze with eyes that were as hollow as a winter sky. "We need to be able to hear you. You've been acting so confused lately, wandering at odd hours. We can't have you locking yourself in where we can't reach you if you have another episode." I felt the blood drain from my face, replaced by a heat that started at my collar. "I am 71, not a toddler in a playpen," I snapped. "My mind is perfectly clear." I looked past him into the hallway, searching for a voice of reason. Alara Garrison, 36, a high school teacher whose usual warmth had been replaced by a hollow, flickering exhaustion, stood in the hallway clutching a stack of ungraded essays as her world was dismantled piece by piece. "Alara, tell him to stop this," I pleaded. She didn't look up. Her knuckles were white against the red ink of the papers she held. She just stood there, her silence a heavy, suffocating weight that felt like a betrayal deeper than the theft of the wood and metal. Bang! The hinge hit the floor. My dignity followed it. Dimitri grunted, hoisting the heavy oak panel away from the frame. The empty doorway gaped like an open wound. Beckett smiled, a quick, sharp expression that never reached his eyes. "There," he said. "See how much more open the house feels. Better intellectual energy, more transparency." He patted Dimitri on the shoulder and began to walk away, his heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood. I sat there on the edge of my bed, exposed to the hallway, exposed to the eyes of a man who looked at me not as a father-in-law, but as an obstacle. The cold draft from the ventilated house hit my chest, making me realize how vulnerable I truly was. My privacy hadn't just been violated, it had been surgically removed. I looked at the 3 jagged scars in the wood where the hinges had been. They were ugly, raw, and permanent. I took a deep, shaky breath, the smell of sawdust and old varnish filling my lungs. I reached for the nightstand, my fingers brushing against a small brass hinge pin that had been left behind. It was still warm from the friction of the drill. I tucked it into the pocket of my robe, a small, hard secret. The empty doorframe gaped like a missing tooth in a predator's smile. I realized then that Beckett wasn't just worried about my safety. He was making sure there were no barriers left between him and whatever he was planning. He thought I was a senile old man who would just fade into the background, a relic of a bygone era of print and paper. But as I sat there, the bitter taste of adrenaline sharpening my senses, I felt the old investigative fire flicker to life in the base of my gut. I had spent 38 years digging through the trash of the powerful, uncovering the rot that lived behind closed doors. Now the door was gone, but the rot was still right here, breathing my air. I watched Beckett turn the corner at the end of the hall. He stopped for a split second, and I saw his hand move to his pocket. He didn't pull out a tool. He slipped a small, high-tech black device out of his palm and tucked it into the shadow of the molding near the ceiling, a lens or a sensor or a microphone. He didn't even check to see if I was looking. Why would he? In his mind, I was already gone. As Beckett turned the corner, he wasn't just walking away. He was carrying the last barrier between me and a man I suddenly realized I didn't know at all. The silence that followed the removal of the door was louder than the drill itself, a thick pressurized void that seemed to suck the very oxygen from my lungs. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long minute, watching the empty rectangle of the doorway, feeling the unnatural spill of hallway light across my carpet. I felt like an exhibit in a museum of my own, making a specimen kept under observation for the benefit of a management I never hired. Shaking off the lethargy of shock, I forced myself to stand. My legs felt heavy, but the journalist in me was already cataloging the scene, noting the precise way the wood had splintered around the hinges. I needed to move to find a space where the walls still had 4 sides and a lock. I retreated to the living room, sinking into my leather armchair. It was a relic from my days at the Times, the hide worn soft and smelling of old leather and furniture polish. I sat in the heavy silence, staring at the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, trying to convince myself that the man who just dismantled my life wasn't a threat, but a savior I was simply too stubborn to recognize. My eyes drifted to the wastebasket near the end table. Peeking out from beneath a discarded circular was a scrap of notepad paper. I leaned over, my joints clicking in protest, and fished it out. The handwriting was unmistakable, Beckett's aggressive slanted scrawl. It was a note addressed to Alara. "We need a second opinion on the old man's deteriorating condition," it read. "The wandering is getting worse. If we don't act now, we won't be able to secure the transition." My stomach performed a slow, nauseating roll. The transition. It was a corporate word, a sanitized euphemism for a burial while the heart was still beating. Do you know what it's like to realize the people you share breakfast with are counting down the days until you're gone? It turns the very air of your home into a poison. I needed a voice that wasn't filtered through the warped perspective of this house. I reached for the cordless phone on the side table, my fingers trembling slightly as I dialed a number I had known for 30 years. Merritt Redmond, 69, a senior attorney whose sharp legal mind was matched only by the pristine cut of his charcoal suits, answered the phone with the gravelly voice of a man who had spent 40 years putting predators behind bars. "Thane?" he asked, sounding surprised. "It's been a while. You still keeping the dream of print alive, Merritt," I said, and my voice cracked, betraying the calm mask I was trying to wear. They took the door, while I was in the room. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence a lawyer uses when he's shifting from a friend to a prosecutor. "Start from the beginning," Thane, he said. "Give me the facts. No editorials." I laid it out for him, the clinical precision of my old training taking over. I told him about the drill, the sawdust, Beckett's oily justifications about my safety, and the silent hollow shell that my daughter had become. I told him about the device Beckett had hidden in the molding. As I spoke, I could almost hear Merritt scratching notes on a legal pad. Thane Merritt said, his voice dropping an octave. He didn't call them concerns. He called them evidence. Door removal isn't home improvement. It's a tactic of psychological isolation. It's meant to strip you of your personhood, to make you feel like a guest in your own home. It's a classic move in the playbook of elder exploitation. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft in my bedroom. "Exploitation," I whispered. "My own son-in-law." "Listen to me," Merritt continued. "People like Beckett don't just want the house. They want the friction gone. They want the assets liquid and the owner quiet. You need to check your inventory, Thane, right now. Look at your accounts, your deeds, and especially the physical assets he might have offered to manage for you. Check the garage. The garage." The word hit me like a physical blow. My 1965 Mustang, a Highland Green beauty that I had restored bolt by bolt over 5 long years, was sitting in the back bay. Beckett had offered to take it in for a tune-up last month, claiming the carburetor was sticking. I had given him the keys, trusting the man who had promised to look after my daughter. I set the phone down without saying goodbye and walked toward the back of the house. The air grew cooler as I approached the garage door. I pulled the handle, the heavy wood sliding upward with a familiar metallic groan. The garage was vast and shadowy, smelling of oil and old concrete. But the space where the Mustang should have been was empty. Only a dark, iridescent oil stain remained on the floor, a jagged silhouette of where my pride and joy used to rest. The empty space in the garage felt like a tomb, and I was the only one who hadn't realized I was being buried. I felt a surge of panic, a hot, prickly heat that rushed to my face. I looked around the workbench, my eyes darting, until they landed on a clipboard hanging by the tool chest. Tucked into the back was a yellow slip of paper. I pulled it out, my vision blurring as I read the words. It was a bill of sale for the Mustang dated 2 weeks ago. The buyer was Pacific Auto Salvage, a junkyard. The price was $2,800, less than the cost of the paint job I'd lovingly applied 5 years ago. My Heelan green beauty. The car I had restored bolt by bolt as a tribute to the summers Linda and I spent driving the coast had been sold for scrap metal. He hadn't just stolen it, he had thrown it away like garbage. But it was the bottom of the page that stopped my heart. My signature was there, the loop of the G and the sharp cross of the T executed with terrifying precision. It was a perfect forgery, an artistic masterpiece of betrayal. I stared at the empty space where my car should have been, my fingers tracing the ink of a signature I never wrote. And I realized the monitoring wasn't about my safety. It was about making sure I didn't see the theft. The garage door creaked as it closed, shutting me in with the ghost of my life, and the sickening realization that my home was no longer a sanctuary, but a crime scene I had been too blind to notice. I stood in the heavy oil-scented gloom of the bay, where my Mustang should have been the forged bill of sale, crumpled in my fists like a spent shell casing. The fluorescent light overhead flickered with a rhythmic dying buzz, casting long, jagged shadows across the empty concrete. I needed to breathe to purge the metallic taste of adrenaline from my throat, but the silence of the house was closing in on me. I turned toward the large rolling trash bin, tucked against the far wall, intending to bury the evidence of the car's theft deep within the household waste where Beckett wouldn't think to look. But as I lifted the heavy plastic lid, a flash of light caught my eye, a sharp diamond-like glint reflecting the dying fluorescent tube. I pushed aside a bag of discarded junk mail and frozen dinner cartons, my fingers brushing against something cold and hard. I reached down and pulled out a heavy object, my breath hitching as I realized what it was. It was a picture frame, the mahogany wood I'd polished for years, now splintered and dull. Behind the web of cracked glass was the face of Linda Garrison, my wife of 33 years, who appeared in my mind as she had in that final photo, vibrant, laughing, and holding a world of kindness in eyes that I now held behind shattered glass. I pulled out a second frame, then a third, our wedding day, and Alara as a 6-year-old at the state fair. They had been tossed aside like garbage, buried beneath the refuse of a week's living. As I wiped the grime from Linda's face, my thumb snagged on a jagged edge of glass, a sharp sting blooming into a drop of red. It was then I saw the truth. The glass hadn't just broken from the fall into the bin. Every single photo had been systematically vandalized. Linda's eyes, her smiling mouth, the very contours of her face had been deliberately scratched out with a sharp object, a nail or a key, before the frames were shattered. Glass. Jagged, sharp, and unforgiving. Just like my son-in-law's intent. He wasn't just clearing clutter, he was erasing the evidence of my heart. I dug deeper, my movements frantic now, ignoring the filth staining my sleeves. At the very bottom, tangled in the heavy plastic of a lawn bag, I found a splash of color. It was Linda's favorite blue silk scarf, the one she wore the day we brought Alara home, the one she insisted on having near her during those final quiet months in 2018. It was stained with something sour and crumpled into a tight ball. Holding that silk brought a sensory flood of hospice care, the smell of sterile sheets, the soft beep of monitors, and the weakened, paper-thin grip of her hand as she pulled me close for the last time. I heard footsteps behind me. Alara stood in the garage doorway, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the frames in my hands. "Are those—" her voice broke. I turned, holding up the shattered wedding. He threw her away, Alara, like trash. She stepped forward, her fingers trembling as she took the frame from my hands. The jagged glass caught the fluorescent light. "No," she whispered. "Beckett said you moved them. He said you were confused and hid them somewhere and forgot. I watched the realization crawl across her face like a shadow. I didn't move them, honey. I didn't forget. He erased them. Alara sank to her knees beside the trash bin, pulling out the camping photo, the one where she was 6 years old and laughing on Linda's shoulders. Her finger traced the scratched-out face of her mother. "He did this on purpose," she said, her voice hollow. "He's been lying to me." It was the first crack in the wall Beckett had built around her. Not a collapse, not yet, but a crack. "I need you to trust me, Alara," I said quietly. "Something is very wrong in this house, and I'm going to prove it." She looked up at me, her eyes red but sharper than they had been in months. She didn't answer. She just nodded once, clutching her mother's photo to her chest. As I helped her to her feet, my thumb brushed against the hem of Linda's scarf. I felt a small, hard irregularity beneath the silk, a lump no bigger than a fingernail stitched clumsily into the fabric with black thread that didn't match. I brought it close to the workbench lamp. There, hidden in the weave, was a small flat GPS tracker. Beckett hadn't just thrown Linda away. He was using her ghost to keep tabs on everywhere I went. The house settled with a groan that sounded like a warning, but I was already moving my socks sliding over the hardwood as I navigated the shadows of my own home like a thief in the night. The darkness of the house felt heavy, a physical weight pressing against my doorless room as I waited for the clock to strike midnight. I had sat in the center of my bed for hours listening to the muffled rhythmic vibration of Beckett's snoring echoing through the drywall. It was a predatory sound, the deep sleep of a man who believed he had already won. As I stepped over the threshold where my door hinges used to be, I felt the phantom itch of the GPS tracker I'd found in Linda's scarf. He was using her memory to keep me pinned under his thumb, but tonight the journalist was going off the grid. I knew every inch of the Garrison estate. I knew which floorboards cried out under weight and which ones held their secrets in silence. I reached the hallway outlet near the linen closet, a fake cover I had installed decades ago, to hide Linda's jewelry from the prying eyes of house guests. I clicked the plastic housing open my fingers, brushing against the cold metallic teeth of the spare key to the garage office. I felt a momentary surge of pride. I had built this house, and I knew where every secret was buried. However, as I pulled the key away, my hand froze. Hidden just behind the outlet box was a small high-sensitivity audio recorder, its tiny red light blinking with a malevolent rhythm. Beckett hadn't just taken my door. He was listening to the very air I breathed, waiting for the floor to creak so he could document my wandering. Click. The lock turned. The journalist was back on the clock. I slipped through the mudroom and into the converted garage office. The air in here was different, stagnant and thick with the scent of energy drinks and that expensive cloying musk Beckett wore like armor. I didn't dare turn on the overhead lights. Instead, I sat at his desk, the blue light of the monitor reflecting off my glasses as the laptop hummed to life. The fan sounded like a jet engine in the absolute silence of the midnight hour. I stared at the login screen, the cursor blinking, with an annoying, persistent arrogance. I didn't need a hacker. I knew Beckett. He was a man of superficial sentimentality, the kind who used family as a convenient prop. I typed in Alara's birthday, and the desktop blossomed into a chaotic mess of folders and failed startup pitches. "Simpleton?" I whispered to the empty room. "You used her birthday as a shield, never imagining your victim might actually fight back." I navigated through the digital debris, my eyes scanning for anything that looked like a ledger. Nestled at the bottom of a directory titled Internal Marketing was a hidden folder labeled Estate Planning. My pulse quickened. I wasn't looking for a will. I was looking for the exit strategy. Do you know what it's like to realize the people you share breakfast with are counting down the days until you're gone? It makes every bite of food taste like ash, and every smile feel like a eulogy. How do you quantify? Apparently, in Beckett's world, it was priced at exactly $38,000. I opened a PDF in the hidden folder, a scanned series of credit card statements for a Visa account I hadn't touched in 3 years. My eyes blurred as I scrolled through the line items. $12,000 at a luxury jeweler for a Rolex I'd never seen. $9,000 for a weekend at a high-stakes suite in Las Vegas. And then the steady bleeding rhythm of the gambling sites. $17,000 lost in increments of 500 siphoned away like blood through a needle. He had opened a duplicate card in my name, a digital shadow that was eating my life savings while I slept. $38,000. He didn't just move in, he started harvesting me. I felt a cold clinical fury settle over my chest, a sharpness I hadn't felt in a decade. I reached into my robe pocket and pulled out my smartphone, the camera lens catching the blue glare of the screen. I began to photograph every page, every transaction my hands steady, despite the roaring in my ears. I was building a case piece by piece, document by document. The screen glowed with the cold light of a digital autopsy, laying bare the rot Beckett had invited into my home. I was no longer just a father-in-law or a napping old man. I was the primary investigator of a high-stakes fraud, and the evidence was damning. But as I scrolled to the final page of the October statement, the air left my lungs. The gambling accounts weren't just tied to the duplicate card in my name. I saw a transfer of $5,000 to a site called King's Table, and the billing address wasn't mine. It was Alara's. He hadn't just siphoned my money, he had opened accounts in her name to spread the digital footprint to make her look like a co-conspirator if the walls ever closed in. He was using my daughter as a human shield for his own addiction. My hands began to shake, then the phone camera losing focus as the magnitude of the rot became clear. He wasn't just stealing our future, he was rigging the explosion so she would take the blame. As I prepared to snap the first photo of the gambling losses, I saw Alara's name on a transaction for $5,000, and the ground beneath my feet finally gave way. The blue light of the monitor felt like a surgical laser cutting through the layers of my fatherly denial until all that was left was the raw, bleeding truth of my daughter's involvement. The screen flickered as I opened the next subfolder, my stomach churning with the knowledge that Alara was either a victim or a co-conspirator. I sat in the unnatural stillness of the garage office, the dry electronic heat radiating from the laptop against my face. My hands, once steady enough to type out front-page exposés under the pressure of a midnight deadline, now felt like lead. I clicked into a directory labeled Golden Sunset Senior Living, and my blood turned to ice. It was an email thread between Beckett and an intake coordinator. Beckett wasn't just managing my life, he was drafting my institutionalization. He had been posing as my primary caregiver, weaving a narrative of a man who no longer existed. I read descriptions of my supposed wandering at night, fabricated stories of violent outbursts that had never happened, and clinical notes suggesting I was a danger to myself. The betrayal was calculated, a medical paper trail built over months to ensure that when the time came, no one would listen to my protests. Lies. Every line of text was a bullet aimed at my freedom. I searched deeper, finding a calendar invite for a notary visit set for this coming Thursday, less than 48 hours away. The urgency of the situation hit me with the force of a physical blow, leaving the metallic taste of fear in the back of my throat. I moved my cursor to a file titled Liquidity Plan. It was a spreadsheet, cold and mathematical, reducing the Garrison estate to a series of variables. I watched as the market value of my home was weighed against the high occupancy costs of a memory care facility. Beckett had calculated the equity liquidation down to the cent, with $850,000 slated for a reinvestment account in his own name. He wasn't just a thief. He was a scavenger picking over the carcass of my life while I was still breathing. Net proceeds $850,000, the screen mocked. Estimated time to closure 60 days. I felt a strategic fury rise within me, replacing the initial shock. This man looked at the house I had built for Linda and saw nothing but a payday. How do you defend yourself against a crime that hasn't happened yet, but is already written in the past tense? The absolute silence of the garage was broken only by the rhythmic blinking of the hard drive light. A mechanical heartbeat that seemed to count down the seconds of my autonomy. I opened a PDF document that made my breath hitch. It was a durable power of attorney already filled out with my personal information and bank details. It was a total transfer of control waiting only for a signature that I knew Beckett intended to get by any means necessary. Beside it sat a draft email to a mobile notary service. He suggested a home visit for an elderly client with limited mobility, claiming I was too fragile to travel. I realized then that the hadn't been about monitoring my health. It was the final psychological blow to make me feel vulnerable, exposed, and ultimately compliant. He wanted me to feel like I had no walls left to hide behind. I am the sole owner, I whispered to the empty room, my voice a raspy promise in the dark. I am the only signature that matters. For now. But the clock was ticking, and the Thursday appointment loomed over me like a guillotine. Listen closely. When they take your door, they aren't looking in. They're making sure you can't look out. My eyes drifted to the bottom of the screen, where a minimized browser window revealed a draft email from Beckett to an unnamed business partner. My heart hammered against my ribs as I clicked it, The recipient was a generic address, but the content was a dagger to my soul. Alara is finally on board with the plan Beckett had written. She just needs a little more emotional pushing to see that the old man is better off in a facility. I'll have the papers signed by Friday, and we can move on the house equity immediately. I stared at the text until the words blurred into meaningless shapes. Was Alara truly a part of this? Or was Beckett simply lying to his partner to keep the deal moving? I remembered the way she had looked at me in the hallway, her eyes flickering with that hollow exhaustion. Had she really agreed to trade my freedom for a payout? Or was he gaslighting her just as much as he was gaslighting me? I felt a profound sense of isolation, a cold realization that the only person I could trust in this house was the man I saw in the mirror. I took a deep breath, forcing the clinical detachment of a journalist to the surface. I couldn't afford a breakdown. I needed evidence. I began to photograph the screen with my phone, the shutter click sounding like a gunshot in the quiet garage. I documented the emails, the spreadsheet, the power of attorney, and the calendar invite. Every image was a piece of armor I was building against the man who lived under my roof. My eyes locked onto the final line of the draft email, and the air left the room. The old man's exit is the only thing standing between us and the payday the text read. The word exit was vague, clinical, and utterly terrifying. It didn't sound like a move to a nursing home anymore. It sounded like a finality. I sat there in the dark, the screen glowing with the cold light of a digital autopsy, realizing that the man I had welcomed into my family was no longer just a thief. He was a predator, and I was the prey. The word exit hung in the air of the garage colder than the midnight draft, and I knew that if I didn't act within the next 48 hours, I might not have a future to fight for. The word exit didn't just hang in the stagnant air of the garage. It felt like a cold, wet blade pressed against my throat, a finality written by a man who had already buried me in his mind. I stared at the glowing laptop screen, my eyes burning from the blue light and the dry electronic heat radiating from the machine. The smell of ozone mixed with the faint scent of Beckett's cologne, creating a cloying atmosphere that made me want to retch. I was no longer just a victim of a financial heist. I was an obstacle in an insurance calculation. I scrolled deeper into the hidden directory, my fingers trembling as I clicked on a subfolder labeled Policy Documents. There in high-resolution clarity was a $500,000 life insurance policy in my name. The beneficiary was Beckett Osborne. I looked at the signature on the bottom, the same perfect digital forgery of my own hand I had seen on the bill of sale for my Mustang. It had been executed 3 months ago, long before the door was taken, long before the first hint of my supposed dementia had been whispered into Alara's ear. He hadn't just been waiting for me to fail. He had been preparing for my end. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me, a physical response to the clinical cruelty of the man living under my roof. I navigated to a folder titled Evidence Logs and found a series of audio files. I clicked the first one and my own voice filled the quiet office tinny and distorted. I sounded confused, repetitive, and utterly lost. But then I heard a glitch, a slight skip in the background hum of the room. My mind, trained by decades of journalistic recording, recognized the edit immediately. Beckett had taken recordings of our casual phone calls and spliced them together. He had cut out my questions and rearranged my answers to make me sound senile. He literally rewrote my sanity, I whispered to the empty garage. I didn't say that. He cut the tape. My own voice. My own words. A digital Frankenstein designed to kill me. The realization left me physically ill, a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. How do you quantify the cost of a betrayal? Apparently it was priced at exactly $500,000 plus the equity in the house. Every time I had laughed at one of his jokes or thanked him for a cup of coffee, he had likely been recording me waiting for a slip-up he could exploit or a sentence he could butcher. My investigative instincts, now sharp and predatory, drove me toward the browser history. I needed to know the how, not just the why. I scrolled through a list of encrypted sites and dark web forums. There were search queries for high-potency sleep aids and pharmacological interactions that cause respiratory failure in the elderly. I found a text exchange with an unverified contact discussing substances that leave no trace in a standard autopsy. The natural causes insurance payout Beckett mentioned in his emails wasn't a hope or a possibility. It was a scheduled event. Accelerate timeline 1 message before the first of the year. I felt the freezing chill of the morning air begin to seep through the garage door, but the cold inside me was deeper. He was planning to murder me in my own bed and call it a peaceful passing. My own voice. My own words. A digital Frankenstein designed to kill me. How many nights had I swallowed whatever they put in front of me, trusting the hands that fed me? I thought of the nightly vitamins Beckett always insisted on bringing to my room, his face a mask of filial concern. I was living in a predator's mouth, and I had been thanking him for the privilege of being eaten. A sharp creak from the hallway above shattered the silence. The house was beginning to stir. I checked the corner of the screen, 5:15 a.m. I had stayed in this den of secrets too long. My adrenaline surged a frantic energy that cleared the fog of terror. I pulled my phone and rapidly took the final 33 photos of the screen, documenting every dark web search and every spliced audio file. By the time I was finished, I had 127 images, a complete digital autopsy of Beckett's soul. I wiped the laptop surfaces with the hem of my robe, erasing any trace of my presence. I shut down the machine, relocked the office door with the stolen key, and slipped back through the mudroom. The morning sun was a cold, unforgiving witness to the fact that I was living in a predator's mouth. I reached my doorless bedroom just as the first gray light of dawn hit the empty frame. I moved with the silent precision of a ghost, tucking my yellow legal pad into its hiding spot in the back of my closet. I needed to get out. I needed to call Merritt, now. My world had changed forever. The house I built was no longer a home, but a trap. I sat on the edge of my bed, my heart thudding a heavy rhythmic beat against my ribs. I reached for my nightly vitamin organizer on the nightstand, my fingers brushing the plastic lid. That was when I saw it. Tucked inside the Wednesday compartment, nestled between my blood pressure pill and my fish oil, was a small clear vial that hadn't been there yesterday. It contained a single unidentifiable white pill. I stared at the unfamiliar pill in my organizer when I heard Beckett's footsteps stop at the edge of my doorless room. He was watching me in the dawn light. Beckett stood in the open gap where my door used to be, his silhouette tall and imposing against the faint kitchen light. He looked at me for what felt like an eternity, his head tilted slightly to one side, like a scientist observing a particularly interesting specimen in a jar. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Thane," he said, his voice smooth and deceptively kind. "Or maybe you're just wandering again." I felt the cold weight of the vial in my pocket as I shifted my mind, screaming for me to run. But my years as a journalist forced a mask of sleepy confusion over my face. "Just the bladder of a 71-year-old Beckett." I replied, my voice raspy with a manufactured grogginess. Nothing more. He didn't move. He just continued to stare, his eyes dark and unreadable. "I thought you might be thirsty," he said, stepping into the room. He held out a glass of water, the liquid sloshing slightly. "It's important to stay hydrated, especially when you're taking new medications." I looked at the glass, then back at him. My skin crawled as I realized the glass of water wasn't just a gesture he was trying to verify if I had already taken the pill he had planted in my organizer. He wanted to watch me swallow the exit he had prepared. I reached out and took the glass with a hand I forced to remain steady. "Thanks," I said. "I'll drink it after I finish my morning stretches. My back is killing me." He smiled. It was the kind of smile you give a dog before you take it to the vet for the last time. "Fine," he said, turning back toward the hallway. "Don't go falling now. We wouldn't want any more accidents." I waited until I heard his footsteps fade back into the kitchen, the rhythmic thud of his movement a countdown. I was determined to outrun. I didn't have much time. I stuffed my yellow legal pad into the waistband of my trousers and pulled on a heavy sweater to hide the bulk. I slipped the vial into my jacket pocket, evidence for Merritt, then navigated the shadows of the house one last time. I didn't use the front door. Instead, I exited through the mudroom, the hinges of the back door silent, thanks to the oil I'd applied weeks ago for a squeak Beckett had ignored. I reached Linda's old Honda Civic, the engine turning over, with a low aging hum that sounded like a roar in the quiet neighborhood. I drove away with one eye on the rearview mirror, convinced that any set of headlights behind me belonged to Beckett, or that black SUV that had been idling at the corner. My breath came in short, jagged gasps as I pushed the car toward the main road, the streetlights flickering past like cold, indifferent eyes. How can a place with bottomless coffee feel like the safest bunker on earth? I pulled into the parking lot of a Denny's 3 miles away, the neon sign buzzing with a rhythmic electric hum. Inside the diner was bathed in the blinding white light of fluorescent tubes casting harsh shadows over the sticky laminate tables. The acrid smell of burnt diner coffee filled my nostrils, a sensory anchor that told me I was still alive. I sat in a back booth, my hands shaking so violently I had to tuck them under my thighs. I reached for my phone, my old friend and legal expert, who had warned me about the red flags of exploitation. "Merritt, "I'm at the diner," I said, as soon as he picked up. "Bring the files. All of them." 30 minutes later, Merritt slid into the booth across from me. He looked older in the morning light, his face etched with a grim professional intensity. I laid it out for him, the 127 photos on my phone, the forged life insurance policy, the spliced audio files, and finally the clear vial I pulled from my shoe. I watched his face turn ashen as he scrolled through the emails about respiratory failure and insurance payouts. "This isn't just greed anymore," Thane Merritt whispered, his voice trembling with a rare flash of anger. "This is a predatory homicide in the making." He leaned in closer, his eyes hard and focused. "You've uncovered an interstate conspiracy. The business partner mentioned in Beckett's emails, the one he's been reporting your deterioration to, is a known associate of a predatory lending ring currently under FBI surveillance." "I don't want a lawsuit, Merritt," I said, my voice cold with a strategic fury. "I want him in a cell." Merritt nodded slowly. "Believe me, when a federal prosecutor tells you to stop breathing until the FBI arrives, you listen. This has transcended a civil property dispute. By using your forged signature to secure federal insurance and using digital communication to plan this exit, he's stepped into the path of a RICO investigation. We aren't just calling the police Thane, we're calling the Bureau." I leaned back against the vinyl seat, the sticky residue of the table catching on my sleeves. The diner's fluorescent lights felt like an interrogation lamp, laying bare the truth I had been too terrified to admit. I had invited a monster into my home, and he had been systematically dismantling my life to build a coffin. Merritt closed the folder, his eyes hard as flint, and whispered the one word that changed the rules of the game Diamond Pacific. The drive back to the house felt like returning to a cage I had built with my own hands, every turn of the steering wheel, a reluctant step back into the predator's den. Merritt's final word. Diamond Pacific echoed in my mind like a funeral bell. It wasn't just a name. It was the name of the shadow that had been growing in my home while I slept. I pulled the Honda into the driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires with a sound that felt far too loud for 8 o'clock in the morning. I sat for a moment gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, practicing the mask I had to wear. I needed to look like the broken, confused version of myself that Beckett had so carefully curated. I needed to be the prey. I adjusted the rearview mirror and stared at my own reflection, smoothing out the sharp, investigative lines around my eyes until only a hollow, watery gaze remained. I walked through the front door, the absence of my bedroom door upstairs, still a screaming indignity I had to ignore. The house smelled of greasy bacon and strong coffee, a sensory assault that felt designed to mimic a comfort Beckett didn't possess. I walked into the kitchen and found him standing by the stove, humming a low, tuneless melody as he flipped eggs with theatrical precision. "You're up early," Thane Beckett said, without turning around, memory serving you well enough to find the driveway. His voice was light, but there was a serrated edge to it, a test disguised as a greeting. I let my shoulders slump and allowed a slight tremor to enter my voice. "Just went for a drive to see the autumn leaves, Beckett. They seem brighter than yesterday." I moved to the table, my movements intentionally sluggish. I noticed his wrist as he reached for a plate. My heart nearly stopped. There, glinting under the harsh kitchen lights, was Linda's vintage watch. It was a delicate gold piece I had locked away in our safe deposit box years ago. He was wearing it openly, a trophy of his dominance over my history. Bacon and betrayal, a traditional American breakfast. Beckett placed a plate in front of me, the ceramic clattering against the table. I watched the grease pool around the eggs, feeling a cold sweat prickling my neck. "Alara was worried when she didn't hear your door creak this morning," he said, sliding into the chair opposite me. "She thinks you're getting more restless." I looked down at my plate, avoiding his predatory eyes. "I think I just forgot to close it," I muttered, leaning into the roll. "Or maybe it's not there anymore. Everything feels a bit open." I looked up then, giving him a vacant, searching look. "Did I take it down, Beckett? I can't quite remember the screwdriver." He let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like a bark. "No, Thane. We took it down. For your safety, remember, you're lucky I'm here to keep track of these things for you." I forced myself to take a bite of the bacon, though it felt like chewing on ash. I watched his hands as he ate the same hands that had forged my signature on the Mustang sale and typed out a plan for my exit. How do you keep your hands from shaking when you're looking at the man who is actively scheduling your funeral? I focused on the ticking of the kitchen clock, every second a heartbeat closer to the checkmate Merritt had promised. I needed to stay in this character for 48 more hours. I needed to be the bait, The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the scraping of a fork against a ceramic plate. It was a psychological war zone, and the front line was my own kitchen table. "You know," Thane Beckett said, wiping his mouth with a napkin and leaning forward, his eyes searching mine for a flicker of the journalist he thought he'd killed. "I've arranged for a specialist to come by tomorrow, just to help you with your spatial awareness. You've been bumping into things, losing your way." I nodded slowly, a dull, compliant bob of the head. "That sounds helpful. A specialist." I knew exactly what kind of specialist he was bringing. It wouldn't be a doctor, it would be a notary with a high-stakes document and a pen. He was moving the timeline forward. He was hungry for the $850,000 of equity hidden in the walls of the house I had paid for with 30 years of honest work. I was a piece of meat on a hook, and the shark was circling with a silver fork in his hand. I looked at the gold watch on his wrist again, the sun catching the face. Linda had worn that on our wedding day. The sight of it fueled a cold internal resolve that burned hotter than the anger. I would let him think I was drowning. I would let him believe the dementia was a rising tide that had finally claimed my mind. "Eat up, Dad," Beckett said, his voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper. "You need your strength for what's coming next." He stood up, towering over me, his shadow falling across my plate like a shroud. I didn't look up until I heard his footsteps leave the room. I sat there in the silence, the greasy aftertaste of the breakfast coating my tongue, and stared at the empty doorway. The countdown had officially moved from days to hours, and the silence of the house was now a battlefield. I reached out and touched the wood of the table, the solid, real grain of it. I was still here. I was still Thane Garrison. And tomorrow, I was going to show Beckett Osborne exactly what happens when you try to bury a man who knows how to dig. Beckett leaned back across the table as he returned to clear the plates, his eyes searching mine one last time, and whispered, "Sleep well tonight, Thane. Tomorrow is going to be a very big day for your future." I stood behind the curtain of my second-floor window, watching Beckett's taillights vanish around the corner before I finally let out the breath I'd been holding for 18 hours. The countdown had officially moved from days to hours, and the silence of the house was now a battlefield. I watched the clock. 10 minutes. That was the window Merritt had promised. True to his word, a nondescript gray van pulled into the driveway with the quiet precision of a hearse. I didn't wait for them to knock. I met them at the door, my pulse thrumming with a mixture of terror and an old familiar adrenaline I hadn't felt since I was chasing down leads in the city's darkest corners. FBI agent Jennifer Davis, a woman whose sharp dark eyes missed nothing, and whose movements were as precise as a clock's gears, stepped over my threshold with the authority of the United States government. Behind her, two younger men carried heavy equipment bags with a practiced silent efficiency. "Mr. Garrison," she said, her voice a cool professional blade. "We have the warrants. Let's move." We didn't waste time on pleasantries. I led them through the living room, feeling like a stranger in my own home, as they began to dismantle the digital cage Beckett had built. As the technical specialists began mirroring the data from Beckett's office desktop, Agent Davis pulled me aside. She opened a folder, her expression grimmer than I'd expected. "Mr. Garrison, we've been tracking this network for months," she said. "You just gave us the front door. But there's something you need to see." She showed me a document on her tablet. My stomach turned. Beckett hadn't just been stealing my savings. He had been using my social security number to apply for a second mortgage on the Garrison estate. The application was in the final stages of approval. He was planning to take the house out from under me before I even reached the memory care facility. I looked at the screen, my vision blurring with a cold, strategic fury. "I want my life back, Agent Davis," I whispered. "Every piece of it." Click. The first lock turned. The house was mine again. By 1 o'clock, the team from Safeguard Security arrived on Davis's signal. The air was filled with the whine of the security drill and the sharp, clean smell of fresh oak and sawdust. I watched them work, a strange sense of empowerment rising in my chest. They were replacing every external deadbolt with high-security locks that Beckett's keys would never touch. The most significant change happened at the top of the stairs. They installed a heavy solid oak door in my bedroom, set into a reinforced steel frame. It was a massive, immovable object, a physical manifestation of the boundary Beckett had tried to erase. "This door isn't just wood, sir," the locksmith said, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's a statement." I ran my hand over the grain, feeling the solid weight of it. "Good," I replied. "I'm tired of whispers in the hallway." Have you ever felt the weight of a key and realized it was actually the weight of your freedom? I felt that weight 10 times over as the locksmith handed me a heavy brass ring. But the work wasn't done. The FBI specialists were busy in the shadows. They mounted 5 high-definition hidden cameras in strategic locations: the garage, the kitchen, and the main hallway. They showed me the encrypted feed on a secure tablet, the cool, slick glass feeling like a weapon in my hand. For the first time in months, I was the one doing the monitoring. I watched the empty living room on the screen, seeing the house as the predator saw it. But now the predator was the one being watched. Now we wait for the spider to come back to the web, Davis said, her eyes fixed on the monitors. The oak door stood there like a silent sentry, a wooden middle finger to the man who thought I was easy prey. I felt a grim satisfaction as I walked through the house, testing the new locks. The static hiss of the gray van's engine cooling in the driveway was the only sound in the afternoon air. I was no longer a victim waiting for an exit. I was a man with a fortress. As the locksmith was packing up his tools, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small cardboard box. Mr. Garrison. I cut extra sets like the agent requested, he said. I looked inside. There were 20 identical sets of keys, a heap of cold brass that jingled like a broken melody. I realized then that the locksmith didn't just give me keys. He gave me 20 sets, which I planned to distribute to Merritt and the authorities to make it legally impossible for Beckett to claim he was accidentally locked out, or that I was too confused to manage my own access. It was a redundant, overwhelming layer of protection. I gripped the heavy ring of 20 keys, their cold brass biting into my palm, feeling the sharp edges through my skin. It was the physical proof that I was taking the keys to my life back. Agent Davis didn't leave immediately. Instead, she set up a secure laptop on my dining room table, the screen glowing with a complex web of names, photos, and connecting lines that looked like a spider's web drawn by a madman. "Thane, sit down," she said, her voice heavy. "I need you to see what you've uncovered." I sat, my eyes tracing the digital map. At the center was Beckett's face, but radiating outward were dozens of connections, lines of money communication, and conspiracy. Davis pointed to the first node. "Your bank manager, Daniel Marsh. We've been tracking him for 8 months. He's the inside contact." She moved her finger. "Sterling Vance Beckett's biological uncle. He runs the entire Pacific Northwest network for Diamond Pacific. Money laundering, elder extortion, suspected human trafficking. Beckett learned everything from him. My eyes followed the lines connecting to lawyers, notaries, motel owners, even a doctor signing fake dementia diagnoses. This isn't just a con man," Thane Davis said. "This is a machine. It's been running for over a decade across 5 states. You just handed us the keys to the entire operation." She zoomed to the final layer, 3 shadowed names: the architect, the banker, the cleaner. "These are the bosses," she said. "We've never been able to touch them. But with your evidence, the Pattersons' testimony, and your financial trail, we finally have enough for federal RICO indictments. We're taking down the whole pyramid." I stared at the screen, at the web that had nearly consumed my family. I wasn't just a victim who fought back. I was the thread that unraveled an empire. "When do we move?" I asked. "We already have," Davis replied grimly. "Warrants executed this morning, Vance arrested in Bellevue, Marsh in custody, the 3 bosses' assets frozen, federal warrants issued. By trial time, Beckett won't just face elder abuse. He'll be a witness in the largest RICO case the Pacific Northwest has seen in 20 years. She closed the laptop, the web disappearing. "You did this, Thane. You and your yellow legal pad. You didn't just save yourself. You saved hundreds of families who would have been next." She stood to leave. "Stay in your room tonight. If he becomes aggressive, we're 2 blocks away. But honestly, I don't think he has any fight left." As the gray van pulled away, I sat in the silence of my fortress, realizing Beckett hadn't just underestimated me. He had underestimated the power of a man who refuses to be erased. I walked upstairs, the smell of fresh oak following me. I reached the new bedroom door and pulled it shut. The click of the deadbolt was the most beautiful sound I had heard in a year. I sat on the edge of my bed, the secure tablet on my knees, watching the driveway feed. The doorbell camera pinged. A familiar black car was pulling into the driveway, the engine idling with a low, predatory rumble. It was Beckett home, 3 hours early. The crunch of tires on the gravel jolted me. On the tablet, Beckett's sedan idled in the driveway. I didn't have time for a slow retreat. I scrambled to hide the FBI-issued tablet beneath my mattress, my movements frantic and fueled by a panic-tinged urgency. I swept my eyes across the living room, spotting a stray screwdriver the locksmith had left behind. I snatched it up and ducked into my hallway, retreating toward my bedroom just as the front door handle began to rattle. "Think Thane," I hissed to myself. "Hide the wire, move the tools." I heard the lock cycle, or try to. The heavy mechanical thud of the new deadbolt held firm against Beckett's old key. "Who was here?" Thane Beckett's voice drifted through the wood, muffled but sharp, with a suspicion that made my skin crawl. "The driveway smells like exhaust." He was inside the house now, likely having entered through the garage door he still thought he controlled. He was inside. The fox had returned to a coop that had suddenly turned into a cage. I slammed my bedroom door shut and threw the bolt, the heavy oak shuddering in its steel-reinforced frame. I was safe for the moment behind the solid barrier Beckett himself had provided the excuse for. I turned toward the large corkboard I had mounted on the far wall earlier that afternoon. It was time to finalize the architecture of my war room. For 38 years I had mapped out the corruption of city officials and the greed of corporate giants, but this was the first time the subject lived under my roof. I began the ritual of organization with a clinical focus that pushed the fear into a small, dark corner of my mind. I pinned the 127 photos I had taken in the garage office, grouping them by the color of the folders I had bought at the pharmacy. Red for the blood he was draining from my accounts, the gambling debts, and the luxury jeweler receipts. Blue for the cold digital emails that planned my end, detailing the memory care facility and the insurance exit. Green for the witness statements, including the grainy photo of the contractor removing my door. Do you know the difference between a bedroom and a war room? One is for dreaming, the other is for waking up everyone else's nightmares. The bedroom was no longer a place of rest. It was a tactical command center, a mirror of the newsrooms I used to lead, before the world decided I was too old to be useful. My legal pad was no longer a notebook. It was a death warrant written in the ink of truth. I stepped back, looking at the jagged red lines I had drawn to connect the banks to the dark web searches. It was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, and the target was currently pacing the hallway outside my door. I reached down and pulled up a loose floorboard near the radiator, not to hide my notes, but to check a spot the FBI techs had pointed out. My fingers brushed something cold and plastic. I pulled out a small, high-frequency jammer Beckett had hidden there, a device intended to cut off my phone signal during the upcoming accident he had scheduled. He had thought of everything except for the possibility that the prey could. I sat on the edge of my bed and reopened the FBI tablet, tapping into the kitchen feed. I watched the screen as Beckett stood by the trash bin, his face twisted into a snarl. He wasn't preparing dinner. He was methodically searching through the bags, his hands tearing through coffee grounds and food scraps. He was looking for the very frames I had rescued, the photos of Linda he thought he had erased. The sight of his desperation gave me a grim satisfaction. Let him search. Let him realize the ghosts are no longer where he put them. I looked at the timeline on my wall, spanning from April to this very moment, and realized the investigation phase was over. I was now a fortress waiting for the predators to realize they'd been locked out of the power they thought they possessed. The oak door stood there like a silent sentry, a wooden middle finger to the man who thought I was easy prey. I felt a strange sense of empowerment, a reclamation of my own skin that I hadn't felt since Linda died. I was no longer a ghost in my own hallways. I was the architect of the endgame. The countdown had hit 0, and the silence of the Garrison estate was about to be shattered. I watched the tablet screen as Beckett's face contorted with rage. He reached for the drawer where I usually kept my spare house keys, the ones I had replaced just hours ago. He grabbed a set and marched toward the back door, his gait aggressive and entitled. I watched him try the key, his shoulder tensing as it refused to turn. He tried another, then another, his movements becoming more violent with each failure. He didn't know about the 20 sets of brass keys sitting in my nightstand. He didn't know about Agent Davis waiting 2 blocks away. He only knew that, for the first time in 18 months, the house wasn't answering to him. I watched the tablet screen as Beckett's face twisted into a snarl, his hand reaching for the drawer where I usually kept my spare house keys that would no longer work. The war was no longer in the shadows. It was on my porch, and I was the one holding the door. I watched the digital ghost of my son-in-law through the tablet screen, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage as the key that used to own my house became nothing more than a useless piece of brass in his hand. The countdown had hit 0, and the silence of the Garrison estate was about to be shattered. I sat in my armchair behind the heavy new oak door, watching the feed as Beckett Osborne tried the lock for the 3rd time. Each failed turn of his wrist seemed to pump more heat into his face until his skin was a mottled, angry purple. He dropped the spare keys, the jingle-sounding tinny, through the tablet's small speakers and began to pound on the wood. "Open the door, Thane," he roared, his voice cracking with a desperation he couldn't hide. "I know you're in there playing games." I didn't answer. I just watched a strange, detached calm settling over me. Through the secondary camera over the driveway, I saw Alara's car pull in behind his. She stepped out, her face a picture of confusion, as she took in the sight of her husband assaulting our front door. "Beckett, what's happening?" Why can't we get in? Her voice drifted through the evening air, thin and frightened. I realized then that the high-frequency jammer Beckett had hidden under my floorboards, the one he thought would silence my calls for help, had been in my possession for hours. Not only had I neutralized it, but the technical team had found it contained its own internal storage. It hadn't just jammed signals. It had been recording Beckett's own whispered threats while he was checking the floorboards, a digital confession of his intent to see me exited. If you think the sound of a key failing is quiet, you've never heard it through the ears of a man who finally has his power back. It was the sound of 18 months of gaslighting coming to a screeching halt. I stood up, the joints in my knees popping, and made my way down the stairs. I didn't rush. I had all the time in the world now. I reached the front door and gripped the heavy, cold handle of the security chain. I opened the door just 3 inches, enough for the chain to pull taut with a sharp metallic scrape. The smell of the cold, damp evening air rushed in, mixing with the scent of the wood. 5 blue Samsonite suitcases were already lined up on the porch, 5 monuments to 18 months of lies. I had spent the afternoon packing them myself, moving with a clinical, journalistic efficiency. "Your things are packed, Beckett," I said, my voice steady and low. "You're no longer a resident of this house?" Beckett lunged at the gap in the door, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "You've lost your mind, old man," he screamed, spittle hitting the porch. "Alara, tell him he's having another episode. Look at him. He's locked us out of our own home." Alara stood on the top step, her eyes darting between us. "Dad, please just open the door. We can talk about this." I looked past the man who had tried to erase me and focused on my daughter. "I know about the $52,000, Alara," I said. "I know about the Rolex, the Vegas trips, and the gambling sites. I know he opened accounts in your name to hide the trail." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of Beckett's ragged breathing. He looked at me, and for a second the rage was replaced by a flickering animalistic fear. 5 blue suitcases, 5 monuments to 18 months of lies. He knew the game was up. I turned my head slightly toward the living room. "It's time, Agent Davis." Jennifer Davis stepped out from the shadows of the foyer, her badge glinting like a star in the strobe-like flicker of the porch light. "Step back, Mr. Osborne," she commanded, her voice a cold, professional strike. "This is a federal matter now." She held out a sheaf of papers, the emergency protection order I had spent the morning securing with Merritt's help. Beckett froze, his hands trembling at his sides. "You have 10 minutes to clear your remaining personal items under federal supervision," Davis continued. "Anything left behind will be considered abandoned property. After that, if you set foot on this hill, you will be arrested." Alara made a small, choking sound. "Dad, 52,000? Is he serious?" She walked toward Beckett, her hand reaching out as if to steady herself. In his fury, Beckett shoved past her to grab one of the suitcases, and a small bank envelope fell from his inner jacket pocket. It fluttered to the damp porch like a dying bird. Alara reached down and picked it up before he could react. The law isn't just words on paper. Tonight it was a steel wall between me and the wolf I'd let sleep at the foot of my bed. I watched the crinkle of the bank envelope in Alara's grip as she pulled out the slip of paper inside. Her face went from pale to a ghostly, translucent white. It was a receipt for a massive withdrawal from her own personal savings account, an account she used for her school supplies and the emergency fund she'd been building for years. It was a sum she had never authorized, signed with a flourish that looked exactly like her own hand. Alara's scream wasn't directed at me this time. She stared at the bank slip in her trembling hands, then looked at Beckett as if seeing a monster for the first time. The man she had defended, the man she had allowed to dismantle our family, had been harvesting her just as greedily as he had been harvesting me. Beckett didn't even try to deny it. He just snatched the suitcase and spat on the porch, his eyes full of a venomous, dying light. "You're both pathetic," he hissed before Davis's hand landed heavily on his shoulder, guiding him toward the stairs. I stood behind the safety of the chain, watching the man who had tried to steal my soul being escorted into the darkness, leaving my daughter shattered on the lawn. At 11:47 p.m. on November 8th, Attorney Merritt's text made my stomach drop. Beckett posted bail. $15,000 cash. Source unknown. He's out. I sat in my fortified bedroom, watching the security tablet like a sentry. Alara slept in the guest room, exhausted from watching her husband dragged away in handcuffs. I didn't tell her he was free. I couldn't bear to see the terror return to her eyes. At 1:58 a.m., the infrared camera flared to life. A black sedan. Beckett's car pulled up and idled the engine a low, predatory growl. I watched the driver's door open. Beckett stumbled out, movements jerky and uncoordinated. Even through the grainy night vision feed, I could see the bottle in his hand, whiskey half empty, catching the streetlight. He stood there swaying, staring at the house he used to control. Then he reached into the back seat and pulled out a sledgehammer. I dialed 911, my voice a harsh whisper. "This is Thane Garrison, 412, Lakeview Drive. My son-in-law just arrived with a sledgehammer. I have an active emergency protection order against him. He is violating it right now. I'm recording. Please send units immediately." The dispatcher's voice was calm. "Stay inside, Mr. Garrison. Do not engage. Officers are en route." I kept the line open, narrating every move as I recorded. Beckett walked to the front porch and stopped at the mailbox, a heavy iron post I had installed when Alara was born. He swung the sledgehammer like a lumberjack splitting wood. The impact was a thunderous crack that echoed through the sleeping neighborhood. The mailbox crumpled metal, shrieking. He hit it again and again until it was nothing but a twisted sculpture of rage. He moved to the decorative garden light near the porch steps, a copper fixture Linda had chosen because it reminded her of a lighthouse. One swing. The glass shattered, raining down like diamonds. The copper bent and broke the bulb, exploding in a soft pop. I watched through the cold window glass as Beckett turned toward the front door. My new front door, the solid oak barrier with the reinforced steel frame. He raised the sledgehammer and brought it down on the lock with savage, drunken fury. The hammer bounced off the steel-reinforced deadbolt with a metallic clang. He tried again. And again. The lock didn't budge. The door didn't even dent. The fortress I had built was holding. But he wasn't done. Beckett stumbled toward the garage, the sledgehammer dragging behind him. He stopped at the white roll-up door and pulled out a can of spray paint black industrial. He shook it, the metallic rattle sounding like a snake's warning, and began to write. I zoomed in with my phone camera, capturing every letter. "Senile old bastard." The words were jagged, dripping a scarlet letter meant to brand me as the broken, confused victim he had tried to create. But I wasn't watching as a victim. I was watching as a journalist, as a prosecutor, as a man who had spent 38 years learning that the truth is only as strong as the evidence you can hold in your hand. "Ma'am, are you still there?" I said into the phone, my voice steady despite my hammering heart. "The subject has just vandalized my garage door with spray paint. The message reads, 'Senile old bastard.' I have it on video. This is evidence of harassment under the protection order. Officers are 2 minutes out, Mr. Garrison." I watched Beckett step back, admiring his handiwork. He turned toward the street, then looked up directly at my window. Even through the darkness and distance, I felt his eyes on me. He raised the spray paint can in a mock salute, then threw it at my window. It hit the glass with a dull thud and clattered down. He knew I was watching, and he wanted me to know he wasn't done. The first police cruiser pulled onto the street, lights off, but engine purring with purpose. Beckett froze, the sledgehammer still in his hand. A second cruiser appeared from the opposite direction, boxing him in. Officer Reynolds stepped out, his hand on his holster, voice amplified by megaphone. "Beckett Osborne, drop the weapon and put your hands on your head. You are in violation of an emergency protection order." Beckett didn't drop the hammer. He turned toward the cruiser, face twisted into a snarl. For a moment I thought he would charge, but then his shoulders sagged. The hammer slipped from his fingers and hit the driveway with a heavy final thunk. He raised his hands, slowly swaying, and sank to his knees. I watched through the window as Officer Reynolds approached, cuffed him, and read him his rights. I watched as they loaded him into the back of the cruiser, his head hanging low, his expensive silk shirt stained with whiskey and rage. I watched as the tow truck arrived to impound his car. By the time the street was quiet again, the officers knocked on my door, and I met them on the porch, the tablet in my hand, the video already uploaded to a secure cloud drive. "Mr. Garrison." Officer Reynolds said, his face grim. We've arrested him for violating the protection order, destruction of property, and public intoxication. His bail will be revoked. He's not getting out this time. I handed him a USB drive containing the full video. Everything is time-stamped. The 911 called recording the damage. He wrote his own confession on my garage door. Reynolds looked at the spray-painted message, then back at me. You did good, sir. You stayed safe, you documented everything, and you let us do our job. That's how you win. As the cruiser pulled away, I stood on the porch looking at the wreckage, the twisted mailbox, the shattered light, the dripping words on my garage door. But the front door stood solid. The fortress had held. The drive to the motel was a blur of rain and regret. The physical reality of the Budget Inn was far more visceral than any screen. The air smelled of wet asphalt and motel soap, a clinical lonely scent that seemed to cling to the very shadows of the parking lot. I found Alara sitting on the curb, her frame looking fragile and aged beneath a thin FBI-issued blanket. She didn't look like the confident high school teacher I knew. She looked like the little girl who had once been afraid of the dark, waiting for someone to tell her the world wasn't as big and scary as it seemed. I'm here, Alara. I'm right here, I said, stepping out of the Honda Civic. She didn't look up at first, her hands clutching the edges of the blanket with a white-knuckled intensity. When she finally slid into the passenger seat, the silence between us was a physical weight, thick with 18 months of secrets, gaslighting, and the things we hadn't dared to say. He was going to kill you, wasn't he? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic slap of the wipers. It was right there in the briefcase, Dad. A plan for a natural exit. He didn't even look back at me when they took him. He just looked at the briefcase, worried about the paper trail. I reached out and touched her arm, feeling her shaking through the wool. He didn't just steal my money, Alara. He stole my daughter's eyes. He spent nearly 2 years training you to see a ghost where a man still stood. He didn't just want the house. He wanted the friction gone. He wanted me quiet and you compliant. I put the car in gear, navigating away from the garish blue-white flicker of the motel sign. We drove in a heavy, pressurized silence until I pulled over into a dark, scenic lookout overlooking the valley. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the fog was rolling in, obscuring the world beyond the windshield. I needed her to understand the depth of the deception, not just the financial theft, but the surgical strike on my very identity. I pulled out my phone and accessed the files Merritt had helped me secure. Listen to this, Alara, I said. I played the audio of a phone call from 3 weeks ago, the one where she had called me crying because she thought I had forgotten her birthday. In the version Beckett had played for her, I sounded confused, stuttering, and unable to remember who she was. Then I played the original unedited recording. My voice was calm, clear, and full of love, as I reminded her I had already sent her gift to the school. Alara leaned her head against the window, her breath hitching. Listen to the background hum, I urged. Right there. It jumps. That's where he used a digital scalpel to cut my voice. He literally rewrote my sanity to make me sound senile. Oh God, she choked out the sound of her teacher's composure finally splintering. I believed him. I looked at you, and I thought my father was dying, but it was just a recording. He made me mourn a man who was sitting right in front of me. How do you apologize to someone for believing a monster over the man who taught you how to walk? The guilt in her voice was a sharp, jagged thing, more painful than the betrayal itself. I turned to her, my own eyes burning. Alara? He spent months cultivating that doubt. He even had a notary scheduled for this Thursday to finalize the power of attorney. Do you know who that notary was? It wasn't a professional. It was an old fraternity brother of his from college, a man with a documented history of falsifying documents for predatory lending rings. He was surrounding us with his own people, creating a cage of forged signatures. I gripped her hand across the center console, my fingers cold but steady. He wasn't just managing our lives, honey. He was harvesting us. Alara broke down then, her body racking with primal sobs that seemed to come from her very soul. The truth was a wildfire, and she was finally standing in the center of the burn. I held her hand as we pulled back onto the road, the headlights cutting through the mist. We were heading back to the Garrison estate, the house I had built with my own hands for her mother. For 18 months it had been a fortress for a predator, but tonight the locks belonged to us. As we pulled into the driveway, the house stood silent and imposing, but for the first time in a year, it didn't feel like a trap. It was just wood and stone again. We stepped through the front door, the smell of fresh oak from my new bedroom door greeting us like a promise. I watched Alara walk toward her room, her movements slow and weighted. She stopped at her dresser, her eyes falling on her jewelry box, the mahogany one I'd given her for her 16th birthday. She reached out her fingers, trembling as she opened the lid to put away the ring she'd been twisting all night. She froze. "Dad," she whispered, her voice a hollow rasp. I walked over, my investigative instincts instantly on high alert. Tucked into the velvet lining, right next to her mother's pearls, was a tiny glinting lens. It was a high-definition pinhole camera, no bigger than a match head, positioned to watch her while she slept. It was the final violation, the ultimate proof that Beckett Osborne's hunger for control knew no boundaries. "He wasn't just managing our lives, Dad," she said, her eyes wide with a new terrifying clarity. "He was recording our souls." I pulled her into a hug, my gaze fixed on the blinking red light. We were safe from him now, but the realization that the haunting had been so intimate made the very air of the room feel cold. We were standing in the wreckage of our trust, realizing the man we had loved was a ghost we had never really known. The first night of safety was anything but peaceful, a hollow victory that felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane, waiting for the wind to change and finish what the man I once called family had started. Alara and I sat in the kitchen, the air thick with the hum of the refrigerator and the unnatural silence of a house that had been violated. We were unified now, but we were haunted. Alara stared at the tiny lens blinking in the velvet lining of her jewelry box, her voice a hollow rasp, when she had told me he wasn't just managing our lives, but recording our souls. I watched her hands tremble as she gripped a mug of tea, the knuckles white and sharp. The high-tech security cameras I'd had installed and the solid oak door to my room were supposed to be our shield, but they felt like monuments to our shared trauma. We attempted a normal dinner, but the conversation was still to the ghost of the family meals we used to have before Beckett Osborne slithered into our lives. "Do you think he's watching us right now?" Dad, Alara asked, her eyes darting to the shadows in the corner. "Even from a cell, I feel like he's in the room." I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. "He's powerless now, Alara. These walls belong to us again." But even as I said it, I felt the weight of the discovery I'd made while scrubbed through his digital footprints. I had found more than just spliced audio. I discovered that Beckett had been live streaming my supposed confusion episodes to a private server, building a social media case for my incompetence in real time. He hadn't just been recording me, he'd been broadcasting my private shame to a paying audience of vultures. Click, another camera found. Another piece of my privacy in his pocket. Every time I thought we had reached the bottom of his depravity, the floor gave way again. I realized that while the man was physically in custody, the psychological walls he'd built around my daughter were still crumbling, leaving her raw and hyper-vigilant. The next afternoon, the phone rang, shattering the fragile quiet of the house. I saw Merritt Redmond's name on the caller ID and felt a cold prickle of dread. "Thane, he's out," Merritt said, his voice flat and weary. "Someone covered the 15 grand in cash for his bail. He's back on the streets." I felt the breath leave my lungs. The speed of the legal system felt like a betrayal. I had a permanent protective order, but I knew now that was just a piece of paper against a desperate man with nothing left to lose. Alara was standing by the stove, and the look on her face when I told her was pure, unadulterated terror. "He's coming back for me," she whispered, her eyes wide. "I know him, Dad. He won't let me go." She immediately began to spiral, her newfound sense of security evaporating instantly. She ran to her room and began packing a bag, her movements frantic and disjointed. I tried to follow her to talk her down, but she was beyond logic. How much is a human life worth in the shadow of a $15,000 bail check? Apparently it's a bargain. She kept muttering about a motel she knew, a place she thought he'd never look, while the foundations of my home turned to sand once again. I begged her to stay, to trust the new locks and the FBI's promise of surveillance, but she was convinced the Garrison estate was just a cage waiting for the predator to return. As I followed her toward the front door, pleading for her to stop, and think my own phone began to vibrate in my pocket. It was an unknown number, a string of digits that didn't belong to anyone in my world. I answered it, expecting a solicitor, or perhaps another update from the precinct. "Hello," I said, my voice sharp with frustration. The voice on the other end was as cold as a mountain grave, a raspy, gravelly tone that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Mr. Garrison," the voice said. "Beckett Osborne was a bad investment. We don't like losing money." I stood frozen in the hallway, the smell of scorched coffee from the burner filling the air. "What are you talking about? I don't know who you are." The caller didn't raise his voice, but the threat was unmistakable. "Your son-in-law borrowed $180,000 from Diamond Pacific. He used this estate as fake collateral. Now that he's defaulted and the feds are crawling up his backside, that debt has a new home. It's sitting on your shoulders now. I felt a surge of angry blood hit my face. I don't owe you a cent, I snapped. My son-in-law is a fraud and a thief. He forged my signature on everything. Your signature says otherwise, the voice replied, followed by a dry, chilling chuckle. 180,000. Pay us, or the girl pays for you. The phone call was a venomous snake sliding through the wire, striking at the very heart of my home. My legal pad was no longer a notebook. It was a death warrant written in the ink of truth. I looked at Alara, who was standing by the door, with her suitcase, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle. She was looking at me, waiting for me to tell her it was okay, but I couldn't find the words. The caller wasn't finished. We know exactly where the girl is going, Mr. Garrison, he said. That little motel on 4th Street she's so fond of, it's not as private as she thinks. I felt the world tilt. Alara had only mentioned that motel to me in a whisper 10 minutes ago. There was no way they could know, unless they were already closer than the FBI had ever imagined. The line went dead, leaving me staring at the screen as the realization hit they weren't just coming for my money. They were already watching the door Alara was about to walk through. The hurricane hadn't passed. We were just entering the wall of the storm. I didn't have time to explain the legalities or the danger. I just threw the Honda into gear, the tires screaming against the driveway as I fled my own home to keep my daughter from becoming a line item on a ledger. The voice on the phone had been a jagged blade severing the last thread of my composure. $180,000. It wasn't just a number. It was a ransom note written in the ink of my own stolen equity. I drove frantically toward the motel. My phone pressed so hard against my ear that my jaw ached. I stayed on the line with a 911 operator, my voice a rhythmic, desperate chant of directions and descriptions. My hands, usually steady from decades of typing out the truth in cold, quiet newsrooms, shook violently against the steering wheel. I realized then that the loan sharks didn't follow Alara from the house by luck. They had already placed a separate tracker on her teaching laptop weeks ago, watching her every move like scientists tracking a tagged animal. I ran 2 red lights, the blare of horns fading into the background of my own internal roar. My mind kept replaying the loan shark's ultimatum, pay us, or the girl pays for you. It was a calculation of flesh and blood, and I was racing against a clock that was already winding down. I pushed the aging Honda to 90, the engine screaming in protest, as I wove through the late-night traffic of the Seattle suburbs. Every shadow on the side of the road looked like a predator, every set of headlights in my rearview mirror a threat. I was a father first and a journalist second, and right now the only story that mattered was the one where my daughter survived the night. I could feel the rhythmic thud of my heart beating in my ears, a tribal drum of panic and resolve. The smell of burning rubber and cold rain began to seep through the vents, a sensory reminder of the speed and the stakes. The operator's voice was a distant tinny drone, trying to keep me calm, while I was staring into the abyss of my own failure. I had let the wolf into our house, and now my daughter was the one caught in its jaws. If you're still riding with me through this storm, let me know you're here. Drop the word justice in the comments right now to show you're still standing by my side. And a quick heads up, the next chapter contains dramatized details for storytelling purposes. If this level of intensity isn't for you, feel free to step away now. I arrived at the motel to find the world painted in the harsh strobe-like flicker of police lights. 2 squad cars were already angled across the entrance, their blue and red flashes reflecting off the grimy puddles in the parking lot. I slammed on the brakes, the Honda skidding to a halt as I leaped out before the engine had even stopped. I saw the door to room 114 hanging open, the wood, splintered and raw where it had been kicked inward. I tried to rush past the yellow tape, my lungs burning with the cold, damp air, but a heavy hand landed on my chest. Officer Reynolds, a man whose face was mapped with the lines of 20 years in the Seattle PD, and whose eyes held the weary weight of someone who had seen too many family tragedies, stepped between me and the motel door. "Stay back, sir. We have control of the room." He shouted, his voice a barrier as solid as the oak I'd once trusted. "That's my daughter. Let me go." I roared, my hands grasping at his uniform, but he held firm, a human anchor in the middle of my storm. He waited until a signal came from inside the room, then slowly lowered his arm. "She's okay, Garrison. She's shaken, but she's okay." The explosive relief that washed over me was almost as painful as the panic. I pushed past him, then my legs feeling like lead as I crossed the threshold into the room. It was a hollowed-out shell, a graveyard for the last of our family's innocence. I found Alara sitting on the edge of the bolted-down bed, wrapped in a coarse, scratchy FBI blanket. Her face was a ghostly translucent white, and a dark, angry bruise was already blooming on her cheek where she had been struck. I fell to my knees in front of her, my hands shaking as I reached for her. They said, "If I didn't have the money, I had to be the payment dad." She whispered, her voice a hollow rasp. They didn't want to kill me. They wanted to take me to work off the debt. The realization of what that meant hit me like a physical blow, a bitter metallic taste of fear coating my tongue. Over my dead body, Alara, I promised, pulling her into a tight protective embrace. I promise you, over my dead body. I looked up at Officer Reynolds, who was standing by the dresser, his jaw clenched in a grim reflection of my own fury. He held out a small white rectangle, a business card found on the bedside table. I stared at the name on the card, the ink mocking me in the flickering neon light. Diamond Pacific Lending. We don't forget. I turned it over, my vision blurring, as I read the 3 words scrawled in black ink on the back. Marcus says hello. I realized then that my son-in-law wasn't just hiding from these people. He was working with them, using our terror as a currency to buy his own survival. He hadn't just sold our house. He had sold his wife's safety to the very men who had just broken down her door. Marcus wasn't just a voice behind a threat. He was later identified as one of the key operators in the Diamond Pacific network, indicted on federal charges alongside the others when the entire structure finally collapsed under the weight of its own crimes. The sterile white walls of the hospital didn't feel like a sanctuary. They felt like a waiting room for the next disaster. The smell of antiseptic failing to mask the stench of the organized rot Beckett had invited into our lives. I sat in the hard plastic chair of the emergency room, waiting area, my knees aching, and my mind reeling from the business card I still held in my pocket. Marcus says hello. Those 3 words were a confession of a betrayal so deep it felt like a physical excavation of my chest. Beside me, Alara was being evaluated in a curtained-off bay. A nurse had already cleaned the bruise on her cheek, but the hollow, glassy look in her eyes was something no bandage could fix. I looked down at my hands and noticed they were still stained with the mud from the motel parking lot. I didn't care. I was waiting for the only person who seemed to know the true shape of the shadow we were fighting. Agent Jennifer Davis arrived 15 minutes later, her expression grimmer than I had ever seen it. She didn't go to the reception desk. She came straight to me, her boots clicking with a sharp military precision on the linoleum. "Mr. Garrison, we need to talk," she said, gesturing toward a quiet corner near a row of humming vending machines. She leaned against the wall, her voice dropping to a low, clinical tone. "Diamond Pacific isn't just a lender Thane. They are a multi-state front for money laundering and elder extortion. The FBI has been building a RICO case against them for 18 months, but they are ghosts. They don't just take houses, they take entire legacies." "My son-in-law didn't just stumble into this," I replied, my voice a raspy growl. "He walked in with a map. He sold my daughter to buy himself a seat at their table. Antiseptic. It kills germs, but it can't touch the rot of a man like Beckett." I felt a wave of nausea as Davis laid out the mechanics of the fraud. Beckett hadn't just forged a few checks. He had used a high-resolution scan of my own handwriting to create a digital template forging my signature on a deed of trust. He had put up the Garrison estate, the very house I had built with my own hands for Linda, as collateral for a $180,000 loan to cover his failing startup's secret debts. The loan sharks were moving to collect, because Beckett defaulted the exact same day he was evicted. It was a setup, Thane Davis said, her eyes fixed on mine. He intended for the group to deal with you and Alara from the start. He wanted you out of the picture, so the insurance payout could clear the rest of his ledger. How many times can you break a man's heart before the pieces simply turn into jagged glass? I thought of the night Beckett had offered me that glass of water, the exit he had prepared, and realized he had been playing a much longer game than I had ever imagined. He didn't just borrow money, he sold the ground we stand on. He expected us to be the collateral damage agent. We were just numbers on a spreadsheet to him. Alara emerged from the exam bay, then her face bandaged, but her eyes burning with a new sharp clarity that I had. She walked toward us, her gait steady, despite the trauma of the motel. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small silver USB drive. "I found this a week ago," she said, her voice trembling but certain. "It was hidden in Beckett's gym bag. I thought it was just old work files, but I saw names of people in our neighborhood. I thought I was protecting my husband, but I was actually protecting a predator. She handed the drive to Agent Davis, and for a moment, the three of us stood in the harsh, flickering light of the hospital corridor, the silence heavy with the weight of that little piece of metal. This drive. It's not just work, Alara whispered. It's a ledger of victims. The silver USB drive was a small, cold bullet, and Alara had just handed me the gun. I watched as Davis took the drive, her fingers closing over it, like she was holding the key to a kingdom. This is the missing piece, Thane, she said. This is how we connect Beckett to the top-tier Diamond Pacific directors. Davis led us to a small administrative office and plugged the drive into a secure laptop. I stood behind her, my breath hitching as the first directory opened. My eyes scanned the file names looking for our own, but what I saw instead made the air leave the room. The very first folder was labeled Patterson_Richard_Dorothy. Those were Beckett's parents. I remembered them from the wedding, kind, quiet people from Spokane, who had looked so proud of their son. I stared at the screen as Agent Davis opened the first directory on the drive, and my breath hitched when I saw the folder containing my son-in-law's own mother and father. He hadn't started with us. He had practiced on the people who gave him life. He had hollowed out his own family before moving on to mine. The realization that I had let a man who could devour his own parents into my home near my daughter made the room tilt. I reached out and gripped the edge of the desk, the cold laminate biting into my palm. We had the evidence now. We had the map of the rot. But as I looked at the names on that screen, I knew that the arrest at the motel was just the beginning. The man who had recorded our souls was part of a machine that had been eating families for years, and we were the only ones left with the strength to tear it down. The drive home was silent, but for the first time in 18 months, it wasn't the silence of secrets and static. It was the quiet of two people sitting amidst the wreckage of a storm, finally breathing the same air. I watched the wipers clear the light Seattle mist, the rhythmic slap-slap matching the pulse in my temple. Alara sat in the passenger seat, her gaze fixed on the passing streetlights, her fingers restlessly tracing the edge of the silver USB drive she'd reclaimed from Agent Davis. We were returning to the Garrison estate, a house that had been a battlefield, a trap, and a laboratory for a predator's greed. As we pulled into the driveway, the high-security floodlights I'd installed bathed the gravel in a cold, artificial white. I looked at my daughter, seeing the exhaustion etched into the lines around her mouth, and felt a surge of protective fury so cold it was almost elegant. I led her inside past the reinforced locks and straight up the stairs to the guest room. This space had once been Linda's sewing sanctuary, a time capsule of fabric bolts, thread spools, and the faint lingering scent of lavender. It was the only room Beckett hadn't managed to fully colonize. Lavender and blood, the scent of a broken homecoming. Alara stopped at the threshold, her eyes landing on her mother's old sewing machine and a framed photo from 1987. She collapsed onto the bed, the weight of the motel ambush and the revelation of Beckett's history finally breaking through her shock. Mom would be so ashamed of me. Dad, she whispered into the quilt, her voice a jagged fragment of its former self. I let him turn her house into a ledger. I reached down and squeezed her hand, my heart breaking for the woman who had been trained to doubt her own father. Your mother would be proud you're standing up now, I told her, my voice low and steady. This room was always about making something new from scraps. That's exactly what we're going to do. I spent the next hour performing the small, grounding rituals of care I hadn't been allowed to do for her in years. I brewed a pot of herbal tea, found an old heavy wool quilt in the cedar chest, and checked the new internal locks I'd installed on her window. Every time a car passed on the street outside, I saw her flinch, her shoulders hunching, as if expecting the door to splinter again. I realized then that while the physical bruises from the motel would fade, the psychological recording of her soul Beckett had conducted had left her feeling permanently exposed. I installed a new lock on this door too. Alara, I said, handing her a small brass key. From the inside. You're the only one with the key now. She clutched it like a talisman, a small piece of autonomy reclaimed from the wreckage. Can a room full of thread and fabric really hold together a life that has been unraveled by a monster? I wanted to believe it could. I wanted to believe that the Garrison estate could be a home again, rather than just a crime scene with a mortgage. I tucked the quilt around her, waiting until her breathing slowed and her eyes finally drifted shut. Only then did I retreat to my own room, the heavy oak door closing with a solid, reassuring thunk. I sat in my leather armchair, the old door hinge I'd kept as a reminder sitting on the nightstand like a piece of shrapnel. I pulled the FBI-issued tablet from my desk drawer, the blue-green glow illuminating the shadows of the room. I was a lighthouse keeper in a storm that hadn't finished blowing, watching the waves for the next sign of a wreck. I began to cycle through the perimeter feeds, my eyes scanning the grainy black and white images of the street. I thought about the file on that USB drive, the Patterson folder. Beckett hadn't just stumbled into crime. He had been a lifelong student of predation, starting with the very people who had raised him. It made the air in the room feel thin, knowing the depth of the void we were fighting. I zoomed in on the neighbor's driveway, then panned toward the line of oak trees that bordered the property. Everything looked still, the suburban night holding its breath. But then I saw it, a tiny pinprick of infrared light, nearly invisible, tucked inside a birdhouse in the neighbor's yard. My blood turned to liquid nitrogen. It was a camera angle I didn't recognize, positioned perfectly to monitor my front porch and the driveway. It wasn't one of mine, and the FBI hadn't mentioned any external surveillance on the adjacent properties. I stared at the blinking infrared light in the neighbor's birdhouse, my fingers hovering over the screen. Diamond Pacific wasn't just watching the house from the shadows. They had been recording us from the outside all along, weaving a web that extended far beyond the walls I had tried to secure. I looked at the shadow box on my wall at Linda's photo and realized the watch wasn't over. I sat back in the chair, the tablet heavy in my lap, and prepared for the shadow I knew was still out there. "I promised Linda I'd protect you," I whispered to the empty room, the silence finally answering back with a warning. "Even if I have to stay awake until the end of time, I won't let them take what's left." I stared at the blinking infrared light in the neighbor's birdhouse, my blood turning to liquid nitrogen. Diamond Pacific wasn't just watching the house, they had been recording us from the outside all along. The infrared eye never blinked a tiny red spark in the darkness of the neighbor's yard that told me the war wasn't over, but had simply moved into the long, suffocating grass of total surveillance. I sat in my armchair, the tablet glow casting a sickly green light across my face, watching the perimeter of the Garrison estate with the clinical detachment of a man who had already been buried once. For 3 days I lived in a state of hypervigilance. I spent my mornings comforting Alara, guiding her through the wreckage of her marriage, and my nights staring at the grainy black and white feeds of our street. Every car that slowed down was a potential threat. Every shadow that moved was a ghost of Beckett's greed. On the afternoon of November 14th, the static routine broke. A black SUV with windows so dark they looked like voids of ink pulled up across the street. It didn't park. It idled, a low, vibrating rumble that I could feel in the floorboards of the living room. I watched it for 4 hours. It never moved for traffic and no one ever got out. It was a mobile guard post, a physical manifestation of Diamond Pacific's claim on my life. "Dad, why are you always standing by the window?" Alara asked, her voice thin and brittle as she walked into the room. I didn't turn around. I couldn't let her see the calculation in my eyes. "Just making sure the neighborhood is as quiet as it used to be." "Alara," I replied, forcing a calmness I didn't feel. "Go back to your book." I noticed then that the SUV was positioned perfectly near the curb, where my exterior electrical outlet sat. I zoomed in on the feed, my breath catching, as I saw a thin black cable running from the vehicle to my own house. They were powered by an illegal tap into my own home, forcing me to literally fund the electricity for my own surveillance. Tinted glass. A black hole where a human face should be. It was the ultimate insult, a parasitic attachment that proved they didn't just want my money. They wanted to drain the very life from my walls. By the 16th, the psychological siege shifted into physical intimidation. I was sitting on the sofa with Alara trying to maintain a facade of normalcy while we watched an old movie when a sudden soft thud echoed from the front door. It wasn't a knock, it was the sound of something striking the wood. I checked the camera feed immediately, but the porch was already empty. I ordered Alara to stay put and opened the door just a crack. Taped to the oak was a plain white envelope. Inside a single sheet of paper held a handwritten note that made my blood run cold. $180,000. 7 days, or the girl disappears. The threat had officially shifted from financial ruin to a countdown for my daughter's life. 7 days. "They're not just asking anymore," I whispered to the empty hallway. Total terror and cold resolve battled for space in my chest. But the journalist in me was already recording the timestamp. "How do you put a price on the air your daughter breathes?" Apparently, Diamond Pacific had the math down. 9:15 p.m. that same night, the velvet silence of the house was shattered by an aggressive pounding at the front door. 6 rapid, heavy knocks that made the frame groan. Alara screamed, her hands flying to her face. "Go to your room, Alara, now." I commanded my voice, booming with a strength I hadn't used in years. I stood in the hallway, the heavy security chain engaged, and looked at the tablet. Two men stood on my porch. Dmitry Volkov, a man whose presence felt like a bruise and whose neck was ringed by the jagged ink of a prison-style tattoo, loomed in the fisheye lens of my doorbell camera. Beside him stood Kent Shaw, leaner and more jittery than his partner, gripping a rusted crowbar with knuckles that were white from more than just the November cold. "Marcus sent us, old man." "You got the letter?" Volkov's voice was a gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate through the door. I recognized Shaw immediately. He was the handyman Beckett had suggested hiring for the Mustang months ago. The circle was closing. "I have the letter," I shouted back, my hand gripping the handle of the door. "And I have the FBI on speed dial. Leave the property now before I make this a federal kidnapping charge." Shaw let out a jagged, nervous laugh, tapping the crowbar against his palm. The front door was no longer an entrance. It was the shield of a man who had forgotten how to retreat. I watched the screen as I hit the record button, capturing the high-definition detail of Volkov's tattoo and the predatory slants of Shaw's shoulders. They didn't flee. They lingered for another 30 seconds, Volkov staring directly into the lens, as if he could see me on the other side. He knew I was recording, and he didn't care. That was the most terrifying part, the lack of fear. I watched the men walk back to the SUV, the one with the crowbar, Shaw stopping to blow a kiss toward my daughter's upstairs window. It was a silent, obscene promise that they were coming back for the only thing I had left to lose. The SUV disappeared into the night, but the threat remained. I had 7 days to save my daughter's life. The following morning, an armored sedan pulled up to the driveway. I didn't waste a second. The following morning, I stood in the driveway of the Garrison estate as an armored sedan with windows like polished obsidian pulled up to the curb. Agent Jennifer Davis stepped out, her face a grim mask of federal authority. She didn't offer platitudes. She simply opened the rear door for Alara. I watched my daughter, her eyes rimmed with red, and her shoulders hunched as if expecting another blow cling to me one last time. Her grip was desperate, the fingers of a teacher who had taught hundreds of children about safety, but no longer felt any herself. "Don't look back, Alara," I whispered into her hair, my own voice a raspy promise. "Just go. I'll finish this." "Promise me you won't do anything stupid, Dad," she choked out. I didn't answer. I just guided her into the car and watched as it pulled away, carrying the only thing I loved to a secure location I wasn't allowed to know. I stayed behind at the house, feeling a crushing weight of isolation settle over my skin like a second layer of clothing. Yet I knew this was the only way to turn my home into a trap. The door slammed. The silence that followed was a physical blow. I spent the next 2 hours with the technical team. They outfitted me with a micro recorder hidden in the casing of my vintage wristwatch and meticulously placed hidden microphones throughout the living room and kitchen. But then one of the techs called me into Beckett's old office. "Mr. Garrison, you should see this," he said, pointing to a secondary router hidden behind the desk. They had found a dead man's switch, a digital script rigged to delete every scrap of evidence on the Diamond Pacific servers if a specific code wasn't entered every 48 hours. It was a failsafe for the guilty. Have you ever played a part so well you forgot you were the one being hunted? I had to find out who was pulling the strings locally. I drove to Cascade Community Bank at 2 o'clock, my movements deliberate and theatrical. I walked into the bright clinical glare of the lobby, making a loud show of my arrival. I approached the teller and demanded to withdraw $10,000 in cash, immediately citing a family emergency that required liquidation. I made sure my voice carried making eye contact with the bank manager, a soft-bellied man who always smelled of peppermint. I loudly inquired about the status of a home equity loan, knowing that if Diamond Pacific had an inside contact here, they would report my desperate fundraising within the hour. It was a gamble, a piece of bait dangled in the dark. I felt the cold, heavy weight of the wired watch on my wrist, a constant reminder that every word I spoke was being recorded by the Bureau. "Testing 1, 2, I muttered as I walked back to my car. "Can you hear the journalist's heart beating?" Agent I returned home and waited. I sat in the silence of my war room, the shadows lengthening across the floor as the sun dipped below the Seattle skyline. At exactly 9 o'clock, my phone began to vibrate against the mahogany desk, hammering against my ribs. "Hello," I said. The voice on the other end was familiar, yet distorted by the line. "We hear you're raising cash," the caller said, a dry rasp that chilled my blood. "Smart man. Tomorrow night, Green Lake Davis. North parking lot. Bring 50,000 or the girl is gone." The phone was a detonator, and the voice on the other end was already counting down. I gripped the receiver, my eyes locked on the recording light of my watch, and then I heard it, a specific wheezing cough from the caller, followed by the faint rattle of a peppermint tin. My stomach performed a slow, nauseating roll. I didn't recognize the enforcer from the night before. I recognized the bank manager I had just spoken to. The man who had smiled while I withdrew my emergency funds was the same man ordering my daughter's disappearance. I realized then that my bank manager wasn't just handling my mortgage, he was handling my daughter's ransom. I accepted the terms, my voice a hollow imitation of a broken old man, and set the meeting for the sting. When the line went dead, I didn't feel fear. I felt a cold, white-hot clarity. The rot wasn't just in my son-in-law, it had spread through the very institutions meant to protect my legacy. I stared at the blank screen of my phone, the silence of the house no longer empty, but filled with the invisible presence of the FBI listening to my every breath. I had the bait, I had the wire, and now I had a name for the wheezing shadow at the bank. The next 48 hours would be the most dangerous of my life. But for the first time in 18 months, I wasn't just a victim. I was the one holding the line. He was arrested 2 days later during the coordinated federal sweep. His position at the bank, nothing more than a convenient disguise for a man who had been laundering fear as efficiently as money. The bank manager's cough echoed in my mind, the wheezing rattle that had betrayed him on the ransom call the night before. Agent Hayes had confirmed his identity within hours. Daniel Marsh, 52, 20-year employee of Cascade Community Bank, and a known associate of Diamond Pacific's enforcement network. But as I sat in my study the next morning, Hayes called with news that made the bank manager's betrayal seem like just one tentacle of a much larger beast. I sat in my study, the phone still warm in my hand, staring at the empty space where my daughter's laughter used to live. The trap was set for Green Lake Park, but my investigative soul told me that the bank manager was just a local limb of a much larger beast. I needed to find the heart. Agent Jennifer Davis called me on the secure line just as the sun began to peek over the Seattle skyline. Thane, we've decrypted the silver USB drive. Alara found, she said, her voice heavy with a grim clinical edge. Beckett didn't start with you. His first victims were in Spokane. I felt a cold surge of moral revulsion as she laid out the timeline. Over 2 years, Beckett had systematically drained $87,000 from the retirement accounts of Dorothy and Richard Patterson, his own parents. He had used the exact same playbook-spliced audio files and forged signatures combined with a relentless gaslighting campaign about early-onset dementia to keep them from calling the police. His own parents, Agena asked, my voice a raspy whisper. How does a man live with himself after that? He doesn't live with himself, Thane, she replied. He lives off the people he breaks. It was then I realized that the Patterson files contained an even darker detail. Beckett hadn't just stolen their cash. He had convinced them to sign over their family home to a trust that was actually a shell company owned by Diamond Pacific. $87,000. The price of a son's love. Every time I thought I had found the bottom of Beckett's depravity, I realized I was just standing on a false floor. I couldn't sit in Seattle waiting for a sting operation, while the original wreckage was still smoldering across the state. I needed to see the faces of the people who had unwittingly trained my enemy. I packed a small bag and climbed into the Honda. The drive to Spokane was 280 miles of high desert highway and self-reflection. The rhythm of the tires on the asphalt served as a cleanse, a physical purging of the toxic energy that had occupied my home. I thought of Linda, my late wife, and the promise I had made to protect our legacy. My mission had expanded. It was no longer just about saving Alara. It was about stopping a predator from ever finding another victim to harvest. How many miles of highway does it take to outrun the shadow of a monster? As I crossed the bridge into Spokane, I realized the answer was zero. You have to face the shadow to kill it. I arrived at the Golden Years Senior Apartments just as the evening wind began to bite. It was a sterile brick-faced complex that smelled of middle-grade floor wax. I found the unit and knocked. Dorothy Patterson, 74, a woman whose once kind face was now a map of sorrow and exhaustion, greeted me at the door with the trembling hands of a mother who had lost everything to her only child. Richard Patterson, 76, sat in a vinyl chair inside his frame, skeletal, and his knuckles white as he gripped a silver walker. His eyes flickered with a mixture of shame and a dormant dying spark of defiance. We sat in their cramped one-bedroom unit, the rhythmic clicking of Richard's walker on the linoleum, providing a somber percussion to our conversation. We shared our stories, and the similarities were chilling. They showed me the yellowed, brittle edges of the checks Beckett had forged. They described the way he had looked them in the eye while telling them they were losing their minds. "We failed as parents, Mr. Garrison." Dorothy said, her voice cracking as she poured a cup of tea. "We let him become this." "No, Dorothy," I said, leaning forward to take her hand. "He failed as a human being. We were just three old people in a small apartment. We were the foundation of a federal case that was finally set in stone. I asked them to testify in the federal RICO suit, and after a long, silent moment where Richard looked at the floor, he nodded. 'We will do it,' he said. 'We'll stand with you.' But then he gripped my arm, his fingers surprisingly strong for someone so frail. His eyes went wide with a warning I wasn't prepared for. 'Thane, there's a second partner, not the bank man. A man in Spokane who handles the physical side of the business, Sterling Vance. He's the one who taught Beckett how to lie, and he's the one who handles the enforcers.' Richard's voice dropped to a terrified rasp. 'Dorothy told me she heard Beckett on the phone yesterday. Sterling is on his way to Seattle to oversee the final collection. He doesn't like loose ends, and he thinks you're the biggest one left.' The low hum of a distant freight train echoed through the room, sounding like a funeral dirge. I looked at the forged checks on the table, and then back at the Pattersons. The alliance was formed. We were no longer victims. We were witnesses. Richard gripped my arm, his eyes wide with a warning I wasn't prepared for. The man Beckett sends for the money isn't just an enforcer, Thane. He's the one who taught Beckett how to lie." The drive back from Spokane was a meditation on monsters, how they're made, how they're hidden, and how they multiply in the dark. I kept the Honda at a steady pace, the hum of tires on wet pavement, a rhythmic underscore to Richard Patterson's final warning echoing in my mind. Sterling Vance. He's the one who taught Beckett how to lie. I reached for the phone in the cup holder, connecting to the encrypted line. "Agent Hayes," I said, my voice tight. Richard Patterson just gave me a name. Sterling Vance. Beckett's mentor, possibly his uncle. He's the architect. I heard a sharp intake of breath. "Sterling Vance." Hayes repeated her voice, dropping into a register of cold professional focus. "We've been trying to connect him to the bank manager for 8 months, Thane. If Vance is the source, then we aren't just looking at a local fraud ring. We're looking at the top of the pyramid." She revealed that their surveillance had already placed Vance as a silent partner in multiple ventures, including a minority stake in Cascade Community Bank. The triangle was complete, the son-in-law, the banker, and the mentor. But the twist in the bloodline went deeper. "Then Oost," Hayes added, her voice careful. "I just pulled the birth records Dorothy mentioned. Sterling Vance wasn't just Beckett's mentor. He was Beckett's biological uncle, Dorothy's brother. A family secret she kept buried for decades. The predation wasn't just taught, it was genetic. Sterling Vance, a name that sounded like old money but smelled like new blood. It made my skin crawl to think how deep the rot actually went, how a man could teach his own nephew to hollow out their shared bloodline. As I climbed into the thin air of the Snoqualmie Pass, the dashboard screen illuminated my tired face. I felt like a man walking through a forest of ghosts, each one whispering the names of victims I'd never met. My phone buzzed with a call from attorney Merritt Redmond. "This is Rico Thane," he said, his gravelly voice filled with strategic clarity. "We're connecting the dots from the Spokane house theft to the Seattle extortion and the bank fraud. We have a pattern of racketeering activity spanning 5 years and 2 states. By bringing in the Pattersons to testify alongside you, we aren't just cutting off a branch, we're uprooting the whole forest." I watched the snow begin to fall in the mountain pass, the flakes vanishing as they hit the windshield. "Good," I told him. "I want the ground cleared so Alara can finally walk without looking over her shoulder." "There's one more thing," Merritt said. "The FBI wants you to review the evidence chain before the trial. They need to make sure every photo, every timestamp, every folder name is accounted for. You're not just a witness, Thane. You're the foundation of the entire case." I felt the weight of that responsibility settle over me like a coat. For 38 years, I'd been the one asking the questions, digging through the trash of the powerful. Now I was the evidence itself, the living, breathing proof that even the most calculated predator could be caught. Pass when a text from Agent Hayes flashed on my screen. I pulled over into a rest area, the engine idling with a weary rattle. The message was short, sharp, and life-changing. "We got them. Sting at Green Lake Park just went down. Dimitri and Kent apprehended attempting to collect bait money. Their panic led them to flip on Sterling Vance within minutes. We have the bosses, the enforcers, and the paper trail." I stared at the screen, the distant muffled sirens echoing through my imagination as I pictured the scene at the lake. The immediate physical threat to my family had collapsed like a house of cards in a windstorm. My breath hitched a jagged, rattling sound in the quiet of the car. "Is she safe?" I typed back, my fingers trembling. "Is my daughter safe?" The reply was instantaneous. "She's coming home tomorrow." The relief that washed over me was a physical weight, making my head drop against the steering wheel. The RICO Act was a giant crushing hand, and Beckett's world was finally caught in the palm. I sat there for a long time, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine and the wind whipping across the mountain rest stop. I realized that the immediate danger had passed, but the war was only moving to a new front. Agent Hayes revealed another sickening detail in the follow-up call. The Diamond Pacific mortgage on my house wasn't just about the money. It was a front for a trafficking ring's safe house operation, which was why they were so desperate to secure the property and remove the owner. They didn't just want my equity. They wanted my walls to hide their own darkness. I looked out at the dark road ahead, the dashboard light glowing like a lighthouse in the void. "Boss is identified," Hayes had texted. "You did it." I exhaled for the first time in weeks, the tension in my jaw finally beginning to crack. But as I shifted the car back into gear, I knew the hardest part wasn't the arrest. It was the trial, where I'd have to face the man who tried to erase me and lay bare the evidence that would bury him. I had 127 photos, a yellow legal pad filled with timestamps, and a lifetime of truth. And I was going to use every word of it. I was no longer the prey. I was the evidence. The dark suit Linda bought for me in 2015 still smelled faintly of the cedar chest, a fabric ghost of a life that Beckett Osborne had tried to auction off to the highest bidder. The 2 months leading up to the trial were a season of sharpening knives, memories, and the truth. Every morning I woke up in my fortified bedroom, the heavy oak door a silent reminder of the war I was finally taking into the light. I arrived at the U.S. District Court in Seattle on a gray Wednesday morning, the air thick with the smell of damp pavement and the low, heavy weight of federal consequence. Alara was waiting for me by the security checkpoint. Her usual teacher's composure, that soft warmth I'd known her whole life, had been replaced by a hardened, quiet strength that made her look older, wiser, and entirely unyielding. "You ready for this, Alara?" I asked, adjusting my tie. "I've been ready since the night he took the door, Dad," she replied. Her voice didn't tremble. We turned to see Dorothy and Richard Patterson approaching. Richard's skeletal hands gripped his walker with a white-knuckled intensity, the rhythmic clicking of the metal against the marble floor echoing in the vast, cold lobby. They were the primary victims, the ones who had unwittingly trained the predator I had let sleep in my guest room. Marble, cold, hard, and indifferent, the floor of justice. We walked together into the courtroom, a space of sterile acoustics and burning overhead lights that felt like a surgical theater. Merritt Redmond met us at the gallery, his face a map of professional focus. This was no longer a property dispute. It was a federal RICO trial, and the evidence was set in stone. The prosecution called me to the stand first. I sat in that wooden chair looking out at the jury, and then at Beckett. He sat at the defendant's table in a sharp suit, trying to project the oily charm of a misunderstood entrepreneur. I recounted the events of November 5th, the mechanical shriek of the drill, the humiliation of standing in a doorless room, and the systematic dismantling of my life. I presented my 127 time-stamped photos and my legal pad notes with the detached clinical precision of the investigative journalist I had spent 38 years becoming. The defense attorney stood up, a man whose smile was as expensive as his shoes. "Isn't it true, Mr. Garrison, that your memory is failing?" he asked, leaning in close. "Isn't it true that you've had episodes of confusion?" "My memory is documented in high-definition digital timestamps," I replied, my voice echoing through the silent room. My son-in-law's lies, however, are only documented in his greed. I watched the jurors lean forward as I described the hidden cameras and the forged signatures. How do you cross-examine a photograph? You can't. You can only lie about what's in the frame. The prosecutor then dropped the hammer, revealing that Beckett's startup wasn't just a failure. It was a Ponzi scheme specifically designed to harvest the social security numbers of his client's elderly relatives. The room went cold as the scale of the predation became clear. Beckett's charm finally began to evaporate, leaving behind the jagged, desperate edges of a cornered animal. Richard's walker sounded like a ticking clock, counting down the seconds of Beckett's freedom as he and Dorothy took the stand next. Dorothy's quiet sobs as she described the $87,000 stolen from their retirement filled the courtroom with a wrenching sadness. Richard struggled to reach the witness box, his knuckles white as he gave his testimony. He was our only son. Dorothy whispered, her eyes fixed on the man who had sold her home while she was sleeping in it. We gave him the world, and he used it as collateral for a lie. The jury looked at Beckett with a visible shock that no defense could mitigate. They were seeing a multi-generational pattern of predation, a man who had hollowed out his own parents before moving on to mine. I hope you never have to see your own child look at you like you're a stranger, but that's the price Beckett paid today. The dry, papery feel of the forged documents being passed among the jurors felt like the rustling of dry leaves in a graveyard. The prosecution rested, and the court entered a brief recess. I stepped into the hallway, needing to breathe air that didn't smell of old wool and federal mandates. I was standing near the water fountain when Beckett emerged with his legal team. They moved past me, but Beckett stopped, his face twisting into a snarl. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of bitter coffee and panic. "You'll regret this, old man," he whispered. "I'll be out before you're in the ground." I didn't flinch. I looked him directly in the eyes with a calm that I could feel terrified him. "I regret letting you into my house," I said, my voice barely more than a murmur. "I don't regret putting you in a cage. In fact, I'm going to make sure you never have a door to lock again." He stood there speechless, the glib tongue that had forged a dozen lives finally failing him. I turned and walked away, my head high, the sound of my own footsteps solid on the stone floor. As I passed the defense table on my way back in, I caught a glimpse of the paralegal's hand. She was wearing a small gold band, Alara's high school class ring. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Beckett had pawned it to help pay for his initial legal consultation before the feds had frozen his accounts. He had stripped us to the bone, but we were the ones standing. I walked out of that courthouse, feeling the weight of the ring Beckett had pawned, and I realized that while the trial was almost over, the restitution for our hearts was just beginning. The 6 days of jury deliberation were ahead of us, but the foundation of our new life was already being poured in the ink of the truth. The 6 days of jury deliberation were a slow, agonizing crawl through the wreckage of our memories, each hour a silent courtroom, where I replayed every mistake I'd made since the day I let a wolf over my threshold. I sat in the hard gallery benches of the U.S. District Court, my hand resting on Alara's, feeling the steady tremor of her pulse. Beside us, Dorothy and Richard Patterson sat like statues carved from grief and endurance. We were a collective of the betrayed waiting for the law to put a name to the rot that had nearly consumed us. On the afternoon of the 7th day, the buzzer sounded. The air in the room became thick, pressurized by the impending weight of a dozen strangers' voices. We filed in my eyes, finding Beckett Osborne as he was led from the holding cell. He looked diminished, his expensive suit hanging loose on shoulders that had lost their predatory arrogance. The jury foreperson stood, a slip of paper trembling in her hand. "Guilty," she read. The word was a heavy stone dropped into a deep well. Guilty. 7 more times the word echoed through the sterile room, covering RICO violations, financial fraud, and the chilling conspiracy to commit harm. Guilty. A 6-letter word that felt like the weight of the world lifting off my chest. I looked at Alara, who let out a jagged sob-like breath she'd been holding for a lifetime. The judge didn't linger. Citing the calculated multi-generational nature of the crimes, he sentenced Beckett to 22 years in federal prison. Marcus and the remaining directors never made it to a quiet courtroom. Their arrests had already sealed the network's fate before Beckett ever heard his sentence. 22 years, I whispered loud enough for Beckett to hear as he was turned toward the exit. "You'll be 64 when you see a door without bars, Beckett." He stopped, his mouth opening for one final plea to Alara, but she didn't even look up from my hand. She was looking at the future, and he was no longer in it. "It's over, Dad," she whispered, as the heavy crack of the judge's gavel signaled the end of the Garrison occupation. "It's finally over." 2 weeks later, the Garrison estate smelled not of ozone or tension, but of fresh-cut wood and the promise of a new season. Alara and I stood in the hallway, watching a local carpenter hoist a massive solid oak door into the frame of my bedroom. Unlike the first time my door was replaced, this wasn't an act of surveillance. It was a collaborative restoration. We had chosen the wood together, a grain so deep and strong, it felt like an apology to the house itself. I ran my fingers over the smooth, cool surface, feeling the agency I had nearly lost. If you're waiting for permission to save yourself, stop. The only person holding the key to your cage is you. I had spent months as a ghost in my own hallways, but as the carpenter tightened the last screw, I felt the ground beneath my feet turn solid again. I made a deliberate choice that afternoon. I asked the carpenter to save the old rusted hinges that Beckett had so violently removed. I placed them into a mahogany shadow box on my wall, right next to a photo of Linda laughing in our garden. Privacy is a right, Alara, I said, looking at the display. But dignity. Dignity is a choice we have to make every day. I'm choosing it now, Dad, she replied, her voice filled with a warmth I hadn't heard since 2018. For both of us. That evening, the house was filled with the scent of fresh garlic and tomato sauce. We were cooking Linda's lasagna recipe, the rhythmic chopping of herbs, providing a soundtrack to a home that was finally breathing again. The orange sunset bled through the repaired living room window, painting the walls in a soft, forgiving light. We ate in the dining room, the silence between us no longer heavy with secrets, but light with the ease of people who have survived the storm. Alara retreated to her room afterward, her mother's sewing sanctuary now redecorated with vibrant colors and new life. I settled into my leather armchair, the warmth of a porcelain teacup grounding me. I looked at the shadow box on the wall, then at the door to my room. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small ledger. I had one final entry to make. I revealed to Alara earlier that day that the first installment of the restitution funds recovered from the Mustang sale hadn't gone back into my savings. I had used it to set up a permanent trust for Dorothy and Richard Patterson. They wouldn't have to spend their final years in a subsidized apartment. They were moving into a small cottage near the coast, far from the shadows of their son's greed. The house was no longer a battlefield. It was a home again, breathing with the steady rhythmic heartbeat of a life rebuilt from the scrap. I looked toward the hallway at the new oak door I had fought so hard to reclaim. I made a final conscious decision. I left the door wide open. I didn't leave it open because I was being monitored, and I didn't leave it open because I was afraid. I left it open because I no longer had anything to hide, and I no longer feared the man who might walk past it. I sipped my tea, the steam rising like a quiet prayer in the twilight. Linda? I kept the promise I whispered to the empty room. She's safe. I'm safe. We're finally home. I closed my eyes, the steam from my tea rising like a prayer. And for the first time in 18 months, the silence of the Garrison estate didn't feel like a threat. It felt like home. I tell this not as a victory, but as a warning. I ignored small signs because I wanted peace, and that silence almost cost me everything. If you take anything from this, let it be this. Don't wait until your home feels like a prison to defend your boundaries. These family revenge story moments are never about revenge. They are about survival, truth, and dignity. In many grandpa stories, people think age means weakness, but I learned it can also mean clarity. This family revenge story reminded me that trust must be protected, not assumed. And like many grandpa stories, I had to become strong again when it mattered most. I believe God gave me one last chance to stand up, not just for myself, but for my family. So don't be like me, speak early, protect what matters, and never surrender your voice. Because every family revenge story begins with silence, and every grandpa story's ending depends on whether you choose to break it. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. Share your thoughts below. What would you do if you were in Thane's position, facing that kind of betrayal? I'd truly value your perspective. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Gentle note. While inspired by real-world themes, some elements have been dramatized for storytelling. If this isn't your kind of content, feel free to explore others that suit you better.